mouthful.
Okay, great. Good morning, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us today. This is Decoding Dyslexia Idaho's first virtual conference, and I'll be honest, it's way outside my wheelhouse. I don't do technology, so bear with me. My name is Robin Zickmund, and I'm a mama of a 6th grade son who is severely dyslexic. And I'm the founder of the Decoding Dyslexia Idaho chapter. So Decoding Dyslexia is a grassroots movement. It started in New Jersey in 2011 by a passionate group of parents that simply wanted to bring awareness to the 1 in 5 children in our classrooms who struggle with dyslexia and help to support our teachers, bring in proper training and early screening to catch these kiddos, and that's really what the movement's about. So I started the Idaho chapter here in 2018, and we're a nonprofit. We now have a board. Dr. Kim Zadel's with us today. She is a member of the board and also a professional development instructor at NNU. So she will be managing the CEU credit offering. So Kim, do you want to share a little about that?
Yes, the course information will be going out to everybody that's registered, and the requirements for the course is to attend this whole day plus, or half day, we put at noon, and then the 4 webinars that are going to be on Wednesday evenings. If you can't personally attend them, then you can do the recording. The requirements are to write 3 key ideas that you got from each of the sessions or workshops, webinars that you attended. And the course, if you register between now and October 30th, you might qualify for a $10 discount. So there'll be $50 for the course instead of $60. And the course will run until December 30th. I don't recommend you wait that long to finish because you're going to forget what you saw. But look forward to seeing the information coming your way, and it should be fun talking to each other.
Thanks, Kim. I'm super honored and excited to have Kristin Barbour with us today. Hi, Kristin. She is our keynote speaker and also the executive director for the National Institute for Learning Development, which is very dear to my heart. They've provided remediation for my son. We have a school here in Idaho, the Joshua Institute, where their educators are all NILD educational. Thank you for being with us today. She completed her education at Johns Hopkins University in the Mind, Brain, and Teaching specialization. Kristin is a licensed speech-language pathologist and has served as an educator in a variety of settings, both in public and private education, K through 12 schools, higher ed, and hospitals. For 15 years, Kristin's provided national and international educational workshops on research-based instructional practices to develop students' thinking and learning abilities. Kristin also served on the International Dyslexia Association's committee to develop the knowledge and practice standards for teaching reading. So thank you, Kristin, for being with us. We'll go ahead and get started.
Thank you, Robin and Kim, and may I just say congratulations for launching your first virtual conference. That is no small undertaking with all of the logistics that go into that. But I just commend you and your vision and passion to see educators and families deepen their understanding and awareness of what does it mean to have a diagnosis of dyslexia, how does that manifest in the classroom, and what absolute gifts these individuals are who have dyslexia and the way that they think and what they bring to new ways of knowing and exploring and understanding. So I'm eager to share with you this morning, bright and early. I'm home here in Virginia, and it is a glorious day today, about 65 degrees. I don't know what it's like there in Idaho. I'm assuming most of you are in Idaho there, but is it chilly there today? Yeah.
It's nice. It's nice.
Okay.
I wanted to mention really quick also, I'm sorry to interrupt, but I will be managing the chat box. So if we would like this to be an interactive conference. So As questions pop up, I will share those with Kristin, and we can discuss things along the way.
Fantastic, excellent. So this morning's session, as Robin and I were thinking about you and planning for the conference today, we really wanted to sort of take a moment and go back to the beginnings and really understand, how do we recognize dyslexia? How do learning scientists understand it from a neurological perspective? You know, advances in technology, brain imaging studies have given us a lot of information. But there's a bit of a debate in the literature and in the real world. Is there anything really that neuroscientists can help us as educators to inform our pedagogy and our practice with students? And so it's not enough just to recognize dyslexia. What are its symptoms? What are its cardinal features? But then how do we support reading success? And how can neuroscientists really help us to understand as educators what we can be doing with students? So our goals for today's session is just to go back to the basics and really look at a definition of dyslexia. And then we're going to cover what are the indicators and how students with dyslexia are identified. And then we're going to look specifically at some practical suggestions. So I hope you're ready to engage this morning. We're going to leverage technology and invite you to make some comments in the chat box. And Kim and Robin, I think, will be helping us to make sure that we're all staying engaged. So I want to go back and encourage you to read this book, Reading in the Brain by Dr. Stanislas Dehaene. He's an excellent researcher, done a lot of work in literacy and numeracy. And Dehaene's book, he talks about learning to read really involves connecting two brain regions. And you can see in the slide on the right, those dots in red are really the object recognition system. These are the visual areas of the brain. Visual word form area, the visual word context, and then the phonemic representation. And what happens when we first learn to read, the brain's visual areas on the left-hand side are being activated. But then there's this connection with the language circuit in the temporal lobe, where regions involved in spoken language, specifically those regions related to phonological awareness, come online. We're going to learn a little bit more about the visual word form area, but one thing to note, in the visual word form area, the size of this area in the brain, as well as its robustness, is directly linked to the time an infant, so from birth to age 2, spends on the lap of an adult or a caregiver being read to. So they're seeing the book, they're seeing print, they're seeing pictures, and they're hearing auditorily the sounds of language. So from birth to age 2, how much exposure a child has to literacy, to print, really robustly impacts this visual word form area. So Dehaene talks about learning to read, and he's categorized it by 3 main phases. The first phase being the pictorial stage. And this is when we're with our littles in the car and they're in the back seat strapped in, and we're driving around our community, and they'll say, "Mama, McDonald's," or "Mama, Walmart," whatever it is. And we think, "Oh my goodness, I've got this bright child, they're reading." Well, actually what the brain has done is imprinted in the pictorial stage these words almost as picture images. So they're not quite reading yet. The next phase is the phonological stage. And this is where children are beginning to imprint graphemes to phonemes, those letters to sounds. And then in the orthographic stage, this is that automatic word retrieval, where students are recognizing the sequence of letters and words, how a word actually looks. So that reading becomes fast and automatic. But Dehaene talks about this brain's letterbox. And we're going to see a short clip in a minute where Dr. Dehaene explains to us about the brain's letterbox. But what's important for us to remember this morning is that the brain's circuitry is rewired by the process of reading. And we're going to take a look at that, what that means in these pruning of the literacy networks and learning to read. So one of the fascinating imaging studies that we can do now, neurologists are doing is something that's called diffusion tensor imaging. And what you're seeing here is a slice, an image of the left-hand side, looking left into the brain. And with diffusion tensor imaging, they are tracking the movement of water in the brain through the different circuitry. And look at this beautiful connection from seeing letters in that back part, sort of that occipital visual area of the brain. And there's this direct connection with this circuitry up into the sounds. So letters, graphemes, are connecting to the phonemes of sound, and then moving sort of in the temporal lobe, and then moving forward into the front part of the brain where we're attaching meaning to those words, where the vocabulary comes in, the semantics comes out. So what does this tell us about brain research convergence with education research? Well, here it is. We need to explicitly teach our students the letter sound symbols. That link between grapheme and phoneme is crucial. Every student, regardless of socioeconomic background, regardless of age that they're entering school, will benefit from explicit and early teaching of the correspondence between letters and sounds. Because then what happens is, once children have been taught this correspondence between graphemes and phonemes, they can then begin to self-teach as they encounter multisyllabic words, maybe words that have affixes, prefixes, or suffixes that they know that they can then add to the root and begin to really decode these more complex words. So we can see that the direct route for teaching students to learn to read goes from seeing the letters, attaching the meaning of or the sounds to those letters, and then attaching the meaning. So let's take a look and listen to Dehane at a conference.
I have no time, of course, to explain to you all of the details of this brain activity, but I want to show you a sort of caricature that you can remember. And it's very simply that reading starts as any other visual stimulation in these generic visual areas of the occipital pole of the brain, but then very quickly moves into an area that we have discovered, which concentrates the recognition of the written word. I have called it the brain's letterbox, because it is where we store our knowledge of letters. And from there, what you have seen is this explosion of activity into at least two networks, one that concerns the meaning of the words, and another that concerns the pronunciation and the articulation of the word. And so we can say essentially from the brain's point of view that learning to read consists first in recognizing the letters and how they combine into written words, and second, connecting them to these systems coding for speech sounds and for meaning. We managed to make a complete map of the areas that have been changed by learning to read. And as all of you in this room know how to read, you can consider that your brain has been dramatically changed. So I've told you about these areas for language. The first major change that we see in the literate brain is this letterbox area coming active only in people who have learned to read. It will activate in direct proportion to the reading score, and it will activate to the letters that you know. It will not activate, for instance, to Chinese if you don't know Chinese. So it has learned the shapes of the letters. It is accompanied by major change in the visual cortex, in your early visual areas, which is generic and serves for all sorts of visual tasks. You have changed the precision of the coding in your visual cortex because you've learned to read. But most importantly, you have also changed your representation of speech sounds. If you've learned an alphabetic language, you have changed the way your cortex codes the phonemes of speech, the elementary components of speech. And learning to read is to a large extent the capacity to attend to the individual phonemes of speech and to attribute them different letters. When we see this map, of course, we could think that the connection between these areas must also be changed. And I'm happy to say that with new methods for identifying the connections of the human brain, we can also track these changes. We can see, even in a living person, all of these fiber tracks that connect different brain areas. We can see their microstructure. And what we see is that, indeed, this particular connection bundle which exists in all brains is reinforced and is being changed in people who have learned to read. And there is a good likelihood that this bundle is involved in connecting the letters to the sounds.
Don't you just love the insights that neurology has given us? If I were to summarize this for us, key takeaways: left hemisphere is definitely influential for language. When we help our students learn to read, we are changing our students' brain anatomy, the structure and the function of it. We are brain changers. Reading connects the spoken system of language to the visual systems. Literacy changes brains. So let's take a look at some dyslexia definitions. It's good within disciplines, education discipline, to have shared definitions, a shared meaning understanding of what we're talking about. So the International Dyslexia Association, one of the leading organizations that really is on the cutting edge of understanding how we can equip educators to teach all types of children to learn to read, and children with dyslexia, individuals with dyslexia. Dyslexia is a specific learning disability that's neurological in origin, and often it's unexplained. There aren't other issues: cognitive abilities, vision abilities, ineffective classroom instruction. It's characterized by difficulty with accurate or fluent word recognition. Certainly, poor spelling is one of the hallmarks of individuals with dyslexia, and decoding abilities. And then some of the secondary consequences, which make sense, would be reading comprehension. If you're struggling to decode and fluency is an issue, we know that there's a strong correlation between reading fluency and reading comprehension. And then, if you struggle to read and it takes so much cognitive energy, you're often going to have reduced reading experiences. So less engagement with reading, less voluntary reading experiences, and that can impact vocabulary growth as well as background knowledge. Then if we take a look at the National Center for Learning Disabilities, again, some of the similarities between the two definitions is that it's a brain-based learning difficulty in reading, writing, and spelling that are not a result of intelligence, hearing or vision difficulties, or lack of access to quality instruction. One of the affordances that I appreciated studying at Johns Hopkins University was this idea of neuromyths, that not everything that we hear in mainstream education is truth. So what are some myths about dyslexia that we want to debunk? Well, early in dyslexia research, it was believed that defects in the visual system were to blame for the reversals of letters and words thought to typify dyslexia. Well, what's the truth? The truth is individuals with dyslexia aren't unusually prone to seeing letters backwards. The key difference here is it's naming the letters. So the problem isn't the problem isn't visual, it's language-based. And then what are the implications? We've got to teach the sounds of spoken words and attach letters to the words so that they can sound it out and see what it represents. Let's take a look at another myth. Well, the myth is that dyslexia suddenly appears in third grade. We've heard that third grade is that watershed year. They're transitioning from learning to read to reading to learn, and this is all of a sudden where dyslexia comes online. The truth is that the achievement gap between typical readers and those with dyslexia is as evident as early as first grade. I want to pause here for just a moment and say, okay, that's talking about the achievement gap. How early can we actually diagnose dyslexia? Several years ago, I went to a Reading in the Brain symposium at MIT with Dr. John Gabrielli, one of the leading researchers in the US doing fMRI studies at the brain, looking at literacy, and his colleague, Joanna Christodoulou. And what we looked at during that time was how early can individuals be identified as having dyslexia? And wouldn't you know, hours-old infants, less than 100 hours old, mamas were giving them up and letting the scientists put electrodes on their brain, and infants were presented with non-speech sounds and speech sounds. So they'd hear a cat, a cow mooing, a car noise, and then they'd hear phonemes, g, ma, ba. And they were measuring the brain's acoustic signals and responses to those auditory inputs. And what they found is that the brain was responding differently in infants with dyslexia because it was a longitudinal study. And they measured in 3rd grade and 4th grade and down the road. And with over 90% accuracy, they could predict, based on those early studies in infancy, which students were going to have dyslexia. So we don't have to wait to identify dyslexia, thinking it's going to appear in 3rd grade. That achievement gap already exists by the time those students have entered in 1st grade. And because of an initial achievement gap in 1st grade, the trajectory without good intervention, research-based intervention, typically these readers won't catch up with typical developing readers. So what's the implication for us as educators, as parents, as instructors at the higher ed setting? Reading intervention must be implemented early when children are still developing these basic foundations for reading acquisition. All right, so now let's take a look at dyslexia prevalence. Is it out there? How many individuals have it? Well, it is one of the most common problems affecting school-aged children. In fact, in the literature, it's as low as 5% to as high as 17% of school-aged children have diagnosed dyslexia. That doesn't even count the undiagnosed individuals. And then nearly 40% read below grade level, and it affects at least 80% of all individuals being identified as learning disabled. So really what that last bullet is saying, under that category of specific learning disability, under the DSM-5, if you want to look at that, reading dyslexia is the highest incident category under that definition of specific learning disabilities. And when we think of dyslexia prevalence, what I also want us to know is that dyslexia is one of the highest heritable conditions. So if there's a family history of dyslexia, it's over 85% heritable. Followed only, I think the only other one above that is bipolar. So dyslexia is a very heritable condition. So what does some of the research saying about dyslexia? Well, we know that we are wired for oral language. Developing oral language is a natural process, but learning to read is not a natural process. The brain has to be rewired, as we heard Dehane talk about. We're wired to speak and to understand language, but think about it, there's so many different symbols, abstract symbols that are used in language. We happen to have an alphabet system. There are others who have more of a pictorial system. The brain has to be wired, has to sort of take over some of those other functioning and specify it for these symbols. So learning to read, as Marianne Wolf says, is almost a miraculous story filled with many developmental processes that come together. So what happens when we learn to read? Our brain is sort of hijacking in that occipital area this place where we recognize faces. When infants are first born, their vision is best paired for about 14, 16 inches. If you think of it, that's when an infant is in the parent caregiver's arms and eyes to eyes. The head's resting in the crook of the caregiver's arm and the baby's eyes is seeing mom's eyes, dad's eyes. Well, what happens with that facial recognition as letters are introduced, that ability to recognize faces shifts over into the right hemisphere. And in the left hemisphere, that's when we start to be able to recognize letters. What's interesting, brain research studies have shown that individuals with dyslexia, they have poorer activation in the right hemisphere for recognition of faces. And it just shows that they're working more effortfully to recognize letters. Usually between ages 9 and 10, this rewiring, the majority of the rewiring process is complete. We have found through neuroscientists that children with dyslexia have less white matter. What does that mean? Less white matter is sort of that connectivity between sections. Remember, we said we're moving from occipital to temporal to frontal lobe. And then they have more functional connections in their gray matter. So they're just more effort in working through being able to decode those letters. Students in early grades through 6th grade benefit from a phonemic or phonetic approach to reading, as well as older underachieving readers benefit from this systematic and explicit phonetic instruction. Children who are poor readers in 3rd grade are 4 times more likely to leave school without a regular diploma. If you're interested in looking at some of the long-term projections of individuals with dyslexia, the National Center for Learning Disabilities has some pretty sobering statistics looking at the number of individuals who are incarcerated, who are functionally illiterate. It's over 85%. There's a huge pipeline for individuals who struggle in school because of dyslexia, and then those long-term implications related to that struggle. So let me just pause here before we move from the dyslexia definition, some of the myths that we've looked at, some of the understanding of the brain, and see if there are any questions. Robin, I'm happy to field any. I can just pause here for a minute before we move to indicators.
I don't see any questions popping through, but maybe we'll give it another minute and see.
All right, so as you're thinking and processing, feel free, put them in the chat box and we'll definitely engage. Okay, so let's look at some of the indicators. We know that at its core, dyslexia is a problem with a component of spoken language. That component of spoken language is phonological processing, getting to the elements of speech sounds. And this affects both spoken and written language. We know too that there are reading fluency difficulties. Reading fluency involves, yes, accuracy, rate, but also expression or intonation. And we'll do an activity together that really highlights how reading fluency, just changing the intonation, impacts significantly the meaning of sentences. Spelling, remember I said spelling is a sensitive indicator of dyslexia, as well as working memory. When we talk about working memory is the brain's ability to hang on to auditory or visual information for a brief period of time and do something with it. So maybe I've seen a consonant, vowel, consonant word with the letters. My working memory has to hang on to those letters, attach the name to those letters, the sound that those letters make, blend them together to be able to produce the sound. So working memory is one of the most influential cognitive processes in the reading process. But as is processing speed, it's that ability to visually take in information, to see a word, to read a word, and then write it. So processing speed has an implication for the ability for visual scanning efficiency, for attention, for concentration. And then what I want us to talk about is reading predictor difficulties. Rapid automatized naming, you've probably seen it as RAN in the literature or maybe in some of the curriculum or assessments that you're using. RAN is the ability to accurately and quickly name colors. You can see in this little picture on the bottom right, there are squares with different colors, to name objects or to name letters. And what's interesting with RAN is that studies have found that naming speed is actually a better predictor than naming accuracy of reading difficulty. So again, naming speed is more predictive of reading disability than naming accuracy.
Kristin, there's a question that popped up.
Sure.
Is there a test we can do in the elementary schools to check for dyslexia without diagnosing it or having a diagnosis from an outside doctor?
Great question, and I'm glad that one is raised. To have a diagnosis of dyslexia, it does require a clinical assessment, and you can see these items that would be assessed through the school psychologist, through a clinical psychologist, through a speech and language pathologist. Any of those individuals would be able to diagnose it. But in terms of a classroom teacher, what you can do is begin to look at some of those red flags that sort of have you sit up and say, you know what, I believe this student may be struggling with dyslexia. So you're beginning to create a portfolio. So definitely do those RAN activities, the naming of colors, of letters, of objects. Begin to see with their reading fluency. DIBBLES is an easy reading fluency assessment that can be done. There are some informal reading assessments. The Eckwall-Schenker is one. The basic informal reading assessment is another good one. So you can begin to also do basic phonological awareness activities, and we're going to practice those in a few minutes. And you could create your own little screening tool that would have these RAN activities, fluency activities, and some of these phonological awareness activities that we're going to do. But that being said, you're creating the portfolio, you're chatting with it with your administrator or your school counselor, whoever is within that hierarchy of who you would have conversations with before connecting with the family. And then you would want to have conversations with the family to say, this is what I'm seeing in the classroom. Tell me some more about what you're seeing at home. Does your child like to read? Is your child guessing and going, seeing the first few letters of a word and then guessing the rest of it? Does your child seem to memorize the pages in the book and always want to read the same book because they've become familiar hearing those sentences over and over again? Hopefully that answered your question, and we can get back to it a little bit more as we're digging into some of the activities. We know that receptive vocabulary is very important in learning to read. So do they understand the words that they've heard? So you may in your classroom have a picture board and have different pictures up on the board and ask your students, point to the desk, point to the lamp, show me the rabbit. In phonics, we're going to do a lot of activities with very young children all the way up to older students and helping you to identify, do students have a strong grasp of phonics? Don't underestimate the power of rhyming and rhyming with nonsense words as well, and what that can tell you as a classroom teacher in beginning to look for some of these hallmark features of what potentially may be dyslexia. Oral reading fluency, and then spelling and writing. So now we're going to get to how do we support reading success in the classroom? Well, we know best practices, and you can go, one of the sites I recommend to you is the What Works Clearinghouse site. They have free educator practice guides, literacy, numeracy, written expression. It's a great resource for educators and parents. And what the What Works Clearinghouse guides are, it's the IES, the Institute of Education Sciences, have done sort of a meta-analysis of the research that's out there, empirical research. So that means in empirical research within What Works Clearinghouse, these are studies that usually are random control trial studies. So there's a comparison and control group, and they've vetted them to say what intervention practices, what instructional practices seem to have small, medium, or powerful effects on the skill sets that we're trying to develop in students. And in What Works Clearinghouse and in much of the empirical literature, a structured literacy approach is the best approach to teaching students how to learn to read, especially students who you think may be struggling with dyslexia or do have a diagnosis of dyslexia. And so the first few that are bolded, we're going to dig into what does it mean to support phonology, phonics with that sound symbol. Why do we need to do syllable instruction, fluency, and morphology? And overarching all of this structured literacy approach is that it's systematic and explicit. And we want our teaching to be diagnostic so we can be prescriptive with the type of instruction we're using or the intervention that we're providing to our students. And so with this structured literacy approach, the IDA indicates that this prepares students to decode words effectively. So let's take a look at our first one, phonology. So we know that phonology, it's just the study of sound structure in spoken words. We're going to get to those individual bite-sized components, words, and sentences. So if you were to take a little quiz here, and let's actually do this. We've got phoneme, phonemic awareness, grapheme, phonological awareness. What are we talking about here with these terms? We're going to play a little matching activity. I want you to put it into the chat box here. So phonological awareness, looking at definitions 1 through 4, take a moment and put in the chat box which number do you think is the definition for phonological awareness. All right, and Robin,
I've got a 1, a 3, a 3, a 1, a 3, a 3. All 3s and 1s coming in.
All 3s and 1s, good. So we can eliminate
4.
We got a 4. All right, what do you think here? Rhyming with phonological awareness, do we think it's the smallest unit of spoken language? No, that's not going to be it. What about the smallest part of written language? No, that's not going to be it either. Understanding that oral language consists of smaller parts. If you selected 3, way to go. So phonological awareness is this umbrella term that children, individuals, they understand that when I hear a sentence, that has individual words in it. When I hear a word, that has some parts in it. All right, good for you. All right, grapheme, quickly enter into the chat box. What do you think grapheme is? Use your prior knowledge to say graph. Let me break apart that word. What does it mean here? So we know it's not going to be 3, it's going to be 1, 2, or 4.
We've got all 2s, Kristin.
100%.
4s.
Yep. Smallest part of written language. We're going to look at what it means to be a grapheme, and can one sound have more than one grapheme to represent it? Then phonemic awareness here. So remember I said phonological awareness is the umbrella term. Phonemic awareness is those individual, able to hear and identify individual speech sounds and words. So number 4 would that makes a difference. All right, so we're going to actually practice with some of this, but first we need to say, why teach phonology? What's the rationale? Well, 88% of school-age children with reading problems, that includes those with dyslexia, have phonological difficulties as the core deficit. Phonological awareness, phonemic awareness plays a critical role in reading acquisition. Here's the exciting part. Research has shown that between 15 to 20 hours of explicit instruction in phonemic and phonological awareness can be incredibly effective for younger students and older students struggling with reading acquisition. What do we need to think about in our practices? We need to teach phonemes explicitly and systematically, but we need to combine this practice with the actual use of alphabetic letters. So let's play with it. Here's what you can do in the classroom. Phoneme counting, quick as you can. I'm going to give you a word and I want you to enter into the chat box how many phonemes you hear in this word. The first word is quack. How many phonemes are in the word quack?
3, 4, 3.
3s and 4s, okay. All right, here we go. Let's do it together. First sound is k. Second sound is w, a, k. There are 4 phonemes because that QU has the k, w sound to it in quack. All right, let's try another one. What about the word shook? How many phonemes in shook?
I've got 3s. All 3s.
All 3s, you nailed it. Let's do it together. Ready? Sh, k. We're going to talk about why in the world sh. It's 2 letters, but 1 sound. Does that kind of phoneme, grapheme have a name? Absolutely. Let's try this one. Last one. pitched. My daughter pitched the softball in the game today. Pitched.
I've got fours and a 5, 4s and 5s. Oh, a 3.
And that TCH is so tricky, and that ED is so tricky in the word pitched too. Let's do it together. Ready? P, ch, t. There are 4 sounds in pitched. That TCH is going together. And ED, what sound is ED making? Ah, ch is an unvoiced sound. So ED is unvoiced, making the t sound. Did you know there are 3 sounds that ED makes? And we need to explicitly teach our children. They say d, ed, and t. Okay, so that's phoneme counting. You can quickly and easily create your own informal assessment. If you're a classroom teacher, have 2 to 3 words. You say the words just like we did together and see if your students can identify how many sounds. All right, phoneme isolation. You pick a number, second letter, or the second sound, the third sound. In our activity today, I'm going to ask you, what's the third sound you hear in each of these words? The first word is mother. What's the third sound in mother? Hopefully, you've said to yourself the voiced TH sound in mother. Okay, what about in play? What's the third sound in play? P, L, A. It's the long A sound in play. What about watched? Third sound in watched. Give you a moment to think. Ch. It's that ch sound spelled TCH. Okay, now phoneme manipulation. You're going to create or have your students create a new word with phoneme manipulation. What happens is you present the word to them and then you ask them to do something with the word. So the word I'm going to give you is cheat. I want you to say those sounds in reverse order in your head and come up with the new word. So if the word is cheat, how would you take each of those sounds and say them backwards to come up with a new one? I'd love to have someone put that in the chat box, what they think they've come up with. The reverse of teach is?
I'm getting all teach.
You got it, I'll teach. Let's try a more challenging one. I can tell Robin this is a great, sharp bunch. Here we go. The word is sigh. If you reverse them, what would the new word be? And what's tricky with phoneme manipulation, I don't recommend pairing this activity with a movable alphabet because you'll see that the spelling is different. Sigh in reverse is actually ice. Okay,
I got some
let's try.
ice.
Good, excellent. Let's try one more. Ready? This last one. Enough. In reverse, what's the word? Robin, do we have any takers?
It took a minute, but I've got fee and funny.
Funny is actually the right one. If you think about enough. Funny. That's a tricky one, but some of you got it. Good for you. Another really good activity to do with your students, just informally as well as in practice with them as you're developing phonological processing skills. Then phoneme matching. You want to isolate a sound in a word and then detect if you can hear that same sound in new words. So the sound that we're going to be looking for is the sound that the letter U makes in the word push. So think to yourself, what sound does U make in push? All right, so the sound is what you're looking for. Do you hear that sound in although? Is that U still making it there? Hopefully you don't hear it. What about in sugar? Sugar. Yes, you hear it. What about in duty? D-U-T. Do you hear it? What about in pump? So with that phoneme matching, you're having the students identify a particular sound and then see if they hear that sound in another word. Okay, so what do we do for our littles, our youngest students, in supporting phonological discovery activities and to supporting this reading success? Remember, by the time students hit first grade, there's already achievement gap that can persist, a reading achievement gap. So first activity I encourage you to do is one that's called symbol stabilization. If we were together in person, I would be handing you movable alphabet letters, letters that are in the shape of the actual alphabet letters. So not, think of like a tile, Bananagrams tile, or another game that's got a tile with a letter printed on it. You want the actual movable alphabet in the shape of the letter. You ask students to close their eyes, hold out their hand, and you put one letter in their hand. And with their eyes closed and using their fingers, they feel the letter. They turn it upside down, rotate it around, and they have to label the name of the letter that you've put in their hand. That is building symbol stabilization. Let's take a moment to think about our abstract alphabet symbols. The alphabet letters are the only thing in our vision, in object-wise, that what it is changes depending upon its orientation. Let me give you an example. A car is a car, whether you look at a car from the rear orientation, a frontward orientation, an aerial view where you're looking down at a car. But what happens with the letter P? Well, if you flip it up, it becomes a different letter. If you rotate it, it becomes a D. If it's down, it becomes a Q. So depending upon its orientation, that's what the letter is. So symbol stabilization activities are fun and easy to do with your young students. In playing, do you hear what I do? Do you hear what I hear? You play again with these movable alphabet letters. You have just sort of alphabet soup in front of them, a lot of little letters, and you say a letter sound, and they have to say that sound and then pick out the letter that goes with that sound. And then alphabet soup, maybe you up it to a consonant vowel consonant or a vowel consonant team working together. So the teacher then would say these sounds and then the student would pick them out. And then you can have the student play alphabet soup where they pull out 3 letters and have to arrange them in a way that either makes a nonsense or a real word. Pre-K and kindergarten, you want to help students store these small pieces of speech information by combining both that auditory and visual modes of input. Okay, so here we go with syllables. Syllables provide the structure, the sound structure in spoken words. We know just in general there are 6 types of syllables, most common syllables. There's an open syllable. It ends in one vowel. Vowel has a long or a schwa sound. You've got it right here. The example is the word be. It's easy to start with young children with open and closed syllables because you can compare be and bed. Listen to the sound of the vowels making in B. It's a long sound usually, but oops, what happens if that D comes in and closes out the word, makes it bed? Well, oh, it squishes the E and makes it a short sound. In bed, it's d. So that E just lost all of its voice and now it's got a smaller voice. So that's a closed syllable. Then when we take a look at diphthong, let's see here. This has 2 vowels together that are typically making one sound, or a vowel that's followed by a consonant functioning as a vowel like W or Y. So our example in this type of syllable then would be eat. R combination, this is where the R sort of takes over the vowel and kind of confuses the vowel and you don't hear the vowel as much. The R makes the vowel say a different sound. So in that example, that would be her. And then consonant LE is always going to be a syllable by itself.
Can I have
yes. Go ahead.
Sorry, quick question. Would you recommend that teachers provide direct, explicit instruction in syllable types?
Yes, but I recommend a combination of discovery learning and direct, explicit instruction. So with discovery learning, I put these alphabet letters. Now, these are the tiles that I was talking about where the letters are imprinted. You can also have the actual letters themselves. I will put the letters or the tiles on the table and I'll say a syllable and the student has to build the syllable. And then I'll say another syllable that's a different type of syllable, and we begin to discover and explore, what's the vowel sound doing? What are the letters in this syllable? Anytime you can help students construct knowledge, it's a deeper encoding and embedding into their long-term memory. So for some students, you may need to come alongside, and once they've played a little bit, discovered some of the ahas with the syllables, then explicitly teach them the labels for these syllable types. But there's lots of activities that you can do, a combination of constructive as well as constructivism, as well as direct instruction. Great question. And then our last type of syllable is that silent E, where you have a vowel plus a consonant and ends in a silent E. So why should we teach syllables? What's our rationale? Well, we want students to help them successfully read words. Rather than having to read letter by letter, they can begin to identify these letter parts within a word. They can relate words to their oral language, and that we know that reading connected text with accuracy and fluency comes when students really understand syllables. Syllables are also an effective way to teach spelling, because you know that when we're adding on suffixes, depending upon the type of suffix, which is a syllable sometimes by itself, it's going to change the spelling of the word. So teach students to decode words, analyze word parts, and I've got listed for you here that What Works Clearinghouse Practice Guide that's got some great examples of activities. And here we go, your question: instruction should be explicit and systematic and in common spelling patterns. But here's what I want us to think about when we're looking at instruction in syllables. You want to have students write words in syllables to actually separate the writing of words in. So let's take a look at this first word, napkin. There are 2 syllables in napkins. When you ask your students to write the word napkin in syllables, have them write the first syllable and then a dash. So they would write NAP dash, so they're physically picking up their pencil, their pen, whatever it is, and then KIN as a separate word part, a separate syllable. Then have your students identify, what syllable type is the first syllable? Ah, it's closed. Always, always have your students defend their answers. Tell me why. Oh, well, closed syllable ends in a consonant and has a short vowel sound. Well, what type of syllable is napkin? Ah, that's a closed syllable too. Let's do it together for the second one. In the chat box, write virus in syllables, please. And Robin, here you go. You're going to get to read all these wonderfully bright people as they're writing virus in syllables.
We have a question also that popped up. What about using boxes for spelling words in syllable?
Okay, so I'm thinking, trying to understand boxes and spelling words. So are you saying that the boxes are identifying the number of syllables, sort of giving some context clues for the learner? Let's see if that person has a chance to respond.
No, it would just be like every line would have like 5 boxes. And so like instead of the dashes, they break it out by the box.
I see what you're saying. Yeah, that's fine. The important part is that students are recognizing that they're seeing these individual parts, these syllables, because if you write it as a whole word and then that sort of slash line through it, it's not as distinctive for the brain as actually seeing them physically apart. It's almost like those Lego bricks and being able to connect or lock them together. So boxes are fine, as long as they're physically separate. Okay, so what do we have for virus? How many syllables?
We've got 2. We've got virus.
Okay, and so then what type of syllable is the first syllable?
Open.
Open, and then the second syllable?
Closed.
Absolutely. Don't let the R combination trip you up, because it will trip students up and they think, well, it's got an R in it, so it's next to a vowel, so it's got to be an R combination. But again, in virus, you can really hear the U sound clearly there, so that R isn't really influencing that vowel sound. And you can do the same for mischief, river, cabin. The second syllable in mischief, what type of syllable is it? Hopefully, they're entering diphthong. Okay, what do we do for our young readers? How can we do syllable discovery activities? Well, first of all, they need to be able to hear the sound. So have them clap it out. Clap with me. How many syllables do you hear? Sometimes you'll see teachers teaching students to put their hands under their chin. How many times do you feel your chin drop? That's how many syllables it is. In thinking about young children, think about link and learn. What you see with these 4 blocks underneath. You want them to hear different syllable types. Start with compound words. Start with the word snowman and have students represent with different felt blocks, different blocks that are of different color, a block for each word, snowman, or each part in the compound word that come together. But then what about snowball? Well, that first syllable is going to be the same color, but that second syllable is going to be a different color because it's now ball and not no man. I think you could do snowflake. So linking and learning, you're helping them to visually see these word parts, what stays the same, what changes. And then word trees are great ideas. In your classrooms where you're identifying syllable types, maybe you've got a word tree that's all closed syllables or a word tree that's all open syllables, and you're building vocabulary, you're exploring definitions, you're talking about syllable types. And again, there's that beautiful weaving of a structured language approach because you're not just teaching these skills in isolation. It's the sounds with the syllables and the activities that go together. So help students hear and recognize different word parts by, again, combining the auditory and visual modes of input. So now we're going to look at fluency, our structured literacy approach. We want to be able to read accurately, rapidly, and smoothly with an expression. And why does this matter? Because fluency really is the bridge between decoding and comprehension. Some have likened fluency to the same way as learning to ride a bike. When you first learn to ride a bike, you're sort of wobbly and unstable. And you've got to pedal fast enough to get that balance and that smoothness. Same thing with fluency. If you're not reading, decoding with expression, it's a little wobbly. You can't quite focus on the comprehension or where you're going because you're concentrating so much on decoding these words. So why is it? Yes, please.
Do you think gumball phonics helps with dyslexia?
You know, that's a program that I'm not familiar with. Can the person who entered that give us a little bit more about gumball phonics? And then we can give some input.
So gumball phonics is like if you have certain letters for certain vowels. So like, for example, if it's a long or a short vowel, you circle it or color it in with one color. If it's like a long, or if it's like a diphthong, it's a different color. So you're like color coding the word based off of the phonics used.
Yeah, so anything that you can do that provides additional input for the brain, so whether it's coloring, whether they're physically manipulating and moving them, all of that is really good. The key that you want to do is always have your students talking. So if they're coloring, if they're marking, that's fine, but then pull language out because language stimulates cognition and language also tells you what's going on inside of their brain. So as the student is marking the color, the long or the short vowel sound, have them say, well, I'm marking this red because the red is all the short vowel sounds and the blue are all the long vowel sounds. So make sure you're pairing language with whatever activity that you're doing, both that combination of guided discovery learning with explicit instruction.
One more question.
Sure.
I would be interested in knowing if the logic of English is a valuable curriculum to explore with all kids K through 12.
So let's have a little bit more background about logic of English. Is that where we're bringing in morphology, which we're going to get to? Is that where we're bringing in where some of the spelling patterns come from and some of the origins of the language? Are we bringing in some of the grammar and the syntax? Give me some more details about this program, please.
Let's see, it has it all, not grammar though.
Okay, so the key in any type of literacy program that you're doing with a student is that it's explicit and systematic. So explicit means there's direct instruction combined with that constructing new knowledge with the students. It's systematic in that there's a scope and sequence that builds on some foundational skills of phoneme awareness, phonological awareness, building up towards grapheme and how we teach graphemes to students, and then into syllable types, so that there's this real interaction between the visual and auditory aspects of language. And as long as it's bringing in all of these different aspects and you've got lots of conversation going on, then it sounds like you've got some useful curriculum or tools in your hands to be working with students. Okay, so why should we teach fluency? What's the rationale? Well, fluent readers will read more. It's that positive cycle. They read more, it increases their skills more, they become even more fluent at decoding unfamiliar words, they gain new vocabulary, they're enhancing their reading comprehension. Fluent readers exhibit enhanced work completion. They can actually get through the content in the classroom that's being required of them. Fluent readers use and understand meaningful chunks of texts. So they get through, and we've probably all done this. Maybe we've read an astronomy journal, or we've read a medical report, or we've read a friend or a spouse's technical report that we know nothing of. We can decode the words. We don't have any understanding of what it is, or very little understanding of what it is that we're reading. Well, fluent readers use and understand meaningful chunks of text because they see these roots, these affixes, and they're beginning to associate, un means not, read means do again, ed means in the past. And so they're connecting meaning with these meaningful chunks of text. And then fluent readers have a more positive concept of themselves as readers. I want to pause here a moment and make sure that we don't overlook a really important aspect of developing reading success in our readers, and that is developing our students' identity as a reader. I want to give you a personal example. My husband and I have a daughter who has just started 4th grade. And as all typical elementary students do, the teachers are doing back to school reading assessments. And so in Virginia, we use the PALS. And her, Elise came home and said, Mom, PALS testing or reading testing is coming up. And I said, okay, anything you need to do to get ready for it? How do you feel? And this is her response. She says, Mom, I feel fine, but I know I'm going to be in the dumb reading group. And I said, oh. I said, tell me more. And this is from, a reading specialist, a speech pathologist, someone who, this is my field of work that I do. And I said, well, Elise, tell me why you feel like you're in the dumb reading group. And she said, well, I've been in the dumb reading group from 1st grade. It's all the slow readers. None of us read very well. We're not kind of smooth when we read. And they give us the skinny books that have big words and lots of space between them that they say are chapter books, and we know they really aren't chapter books. And so part of my job as a parent and part of my job as an educator is to make sure that we're helping our students to develop their identity as a reader, where they feel efficacy. They feel confident that they're learning strategies to approach decoding, that they understand word families, rhyming, they understand graphemes, and that they see themselves, they view themselves as a reader. Because what neuroscientists are telling us is that that affective or that emotional part of learning is as significant as the cognitive and ability skills that are involved in reading. So we want to make sure that we're helping our students to develop efficacy and their identity as a reader. So as you're thinking about your grouping of students, consider mixed ability groupings from time to time. Doesn't mean you always have to use them, but here's what happened. When you pair your less fluent readers with more fluent readers that are their peers, they're hearing a model that they resonate with. And that's a great influence for them. And so give them opportunities to change in and out of different reading grouping abilities. So just be mindful of that and look for opportunities to build their decoding skills and fluency. Another really important part to reading fluency and comprehension is prior knowledge and interest. It was a fascinating study that looked at typically developing readers and readers with dyslexia, students with dyslexia. And they took a reading passage and had students, grade 4 students, read the reading passage and answer comprehension questions. And those typically developing readers scored stronger than those readers who were struggling readers, until they took a reading passage that these struggling readers had prior knowledge and interest in, and it just so happened to be baseball. Wouldn't you know that then when they did a reading comprehension test, the students with the interest in baseball and prior experience, regardless of whether they were typically developing reader or with dyslexia, they scored higher in the comprehension. So just a note here, as educators, as parents, find out what your children are interested in. Find out what motivates your students and find text and books that can engage them, where they can connect prior knowledge, because that's going to enhance their fluency and their comprehension as well. So I've given you another What Works Clearinghouse on practices to promote fluency. It's a great guide for educators and parents, looking at decoding words, analyzing parts, writing and recognizing those words. Do practice with sight vocabulary words. And because, you know, sight words, the challenge with that, and Fry's reading lists, Fry's, you know, sight words, there's a lot of sight word lists out there, but the challenge with sight words is that they don't follow the typical patterns. So there needs to be sort of this orthographic recognition of the sight word. Think about prior vocabulary and familiarity. You want to model fluent reading. What we have found in the research is that guided, repeated oral reading is a really effective approach to developing students' fluency. Interestingly, in the classroom, fluency is the most often overlooked aspect of reading. Not much time is spent. And let me say that silent reading isn't really fluency practice that gives you a lot of information, because you don't know what the student is decoding when they're reading silently. So that oral reading practice is really important. You can do the neurological impress method, the NIM. What that is you pair a reader, a less fluent, with a more fluent reader. And that more fluent reader could be yourself, could be the teacher's aide, could be a peer, reads just slightly a little ahead of the less fluent reader. So it's like they're modeling for them, and the less fluent reader's brain is hearing that auditory input of that more fluent reader. Typically, when you are repeated reading to practice fluency, 2 to 5 times in the repeated reading is what it takes before you should move on to the next activity. So say a student is decoding the sentence. Maybe if we go back to this first bullet point, fluent readers will read more, which contributes to increased skills. Say they stumble over the word increased. When you notice that, have them go back and say, repeat after me, increased. They say increased, then you go back and you read the whole sentence several times, once together with the student, and then the student 2 or 3 times by themselves. And you can do this in ways that it doesn't shame them. You can get the whole class to read together again. You can say front row read, back row read, read in a dynamic voice, read in a quiet voice. I mean, you can make it fun and lots of different ways to engage students so that you're not having little Sally read the sentence 5 times by herself. There's lots of ways you can do that so that that stigma doesn't feel all on the shoulders of that one student. But we know that instruction should be explicit and systematic, and you want to help students to recognize those common spelling patterns as well. So when we're thinking about how should we choose our texts for fluency practice, you want to have students read for fluency practice texts that are at their independent reading level. So they're about 95% accuracy. It's slightly above their instructional level. You want to restrict the reading passages to about 50 to 200 words. Include a variety. Poetry is great. Nonfiction, interesting stories, grab something off the internet. But employ intentionality. Look for specific words or patterns to practice. Shel Silverstein wrote a great book, Runny Babbitt. There's a lot of play on words, and so you can practice different word patterns there. And then maybe you're thinking about specific content you're wanting to promote, and then comprehension or self-questioning. So practices to promote fluency: engage in choral reading. Everybody together read. This column in front of me read. Maybe you engage in pair reading. And then I already mentioned the mixability grouping. And then again, from Marianne Wolf's book, Dyslexia, Fluency in the Brain, which is a great read for those of you who may be interested. Let me just read this quote for us. The most successful fluency intervention described to date, repeated reading, is effective because it provides the kind of repeated exposure to words that leads either to the formation of new orthographic images and increases efficiency and access to images already formed. And it should be or. My video feed is closing out, not being able to see that part, but I would go back and reread it too. It provides the kinds of repeated exposure to words that leads either to the formation of new orthographic images or increases efficiency of access to images already formed.
I have a comment, a question.
Yes, please.
Can you talk about the importance of, oh dear, Alayna, are you there?
Yes, just wondering if you can mention the importance of prosody and accuracy in fluency. I get confused that folks think fluency is just number of words read correctly in a minute, and it's so much more than that.
It is, and Alayna, I'm so glad you asked, because here we're going to practice what prosody does with fluency and impacting meaning. So we're going to practice it. So we've got one sentence. In the chat box is I'm going to read the sentence with the bolded word emphasized. I would like you in the chat box to tell me the meaning of the sentence after I say it. Here we go. Here's the first one. I didn't take your money. What do you think that sentence means?
Someone else did. It
Bingo.
wasn't me.
It wasn't me. Someone else did. Let's try the next sentence. I didn't take your money. What does that one mean?
Denial.
Yes, great word. How dare you? Let's try the next one. I didn't take your money.
No comments. Borrowed? I might have done something.
Yeah,
I might have done something else with it.
Maybe I borrowed it. Maybe I stole it. I did something else with it. I didn't take your money.
It was someone else's. I took someone else's.
That's right. And this last one is one of my favorites. I didn't take your money.
I took something else.
Yes. I took your bag. I took your shoes. I took your cup. I took your phone. One sentence. Alayna, exactly what you're saying with prosody. It changes the meaning completely. Your students will love this activity, and it gives them a discovery experience that all the words are the same, but simply by the way we provide prosody, read with expression, emphasis, the phrasing. Another great activity for developing prosody, you can help students learn to identify prepositional phrases and read the prepositional phrases as together as a chunk or in a different voice. Students love the opportunity to read in different voices. I'm a drama person now. I'm an opera singer. I'm from England. I'm reading with an accent. Gives them great fluency practice. It allows them to sort of come outside of themselves and bring some novelty to it as well. Expression does create meaning. Lack of expression smothers meaning. We've all had those people who are very flat in their expression, and it's just hard to pay attention to really understand what is being communicated. That's why I believe for those of you who are teaching online, whether it's through teletherapy, whether it's teaching online your students in the classroom, it requires us as educators to be even more dynamic and intentional with some of these, what we call supra-segmental aspects of language, these pieces that we layer on top of language, from our facial expressions to the way we use our hands, to the way we move into the computer, back up, all of that, emphasizing our words. It's very important for our students. A child who is reading accurately but fluently at grade level still requires but not fluently at grade level, still requires intensive instruction. Okay, so now we're getting towards the end here. We're going to take a look at morphology. What do we mean here? Well, it's the study of meaningful parts of words and how they're connected. It's why I did intentionally these puzzle pieces. We have our roots, our center parts. We've got our prefixes that come before and our suffixes. We've got the root flecked. What does that mean? What does the prefix re mean and the suffix ing mean? What happens if we combine them with different roots, prefixes, and suffixes? So let's take a minute and take a look at root, morpheme, prefix, and suffix. What is the definition? So a morpheme, I'm in the top blue box, a morpheme added to a root or base that often changes the part of speech and modifies its meaning. What do we think here? Now I'm going to the one underneath it, a morpheme that precedes a root or base word that modifies the meaning of the word. Aha, so we've got prefix and suffix, suffix at top, prefix at the bottom. Smallest unit of a word that carries meaning is a morpheme. And then the root, a morpheme that can't stand alone, but that's used to form families of words with related meanings. It's important to teach your students these definitions for them to become familiar with them. Why should we teach morphology? Morphology can be very motivating to students. It's like giving them a key to unlock language, unlock spelling, unlock meaning, and it challenges students. It impacts decoding, impacts fluency. If I don't have to look at the RE and think individually what that says, I know it's an open syllable, I know it has a sound to it, I know it has a meaning. It impacts decoding, fluency, vocabulary development, reading comprehension, and memory for words. Morphology is a key tool that all educators should be using to develop literacy in their students. Encourage discovery learning. Allow students to explore before offering help, and we're going to practice that together, because what we want to do is to generate intellectual curiosity about words in our learners. We want them to begin to, I wonder what this word means. Let me see what parts I already know, what parts I can derive meaning from. So let's do a couple of different activities. In this first word, this is just a word wheel. It's a discovery activity, a multiple meaning activity. I've got one word in the center here, the word jam. I'd like you to write, if you can, 4 different simple definitions for that word jam. If you had this word wheel in front of you, you'd put it right in each of those circles, but just enter into the chat box maybe 2 definitions that you could think of for jam. I'll give you about 60 seconds.
I've got food, unstructured music, a tough spot to be in, jelly, a wedge place, stuff on toast, condiment.
Nice. Anybody put in blocked traffic? You're in a jam, traffic jam. You guys are good thinkers. You can pick any multiple meaning word, get them into a word wheel, and have your students begin to explore and discover. But it's not enough. Once they've written those brief definitions, then underneath, what part of speech is that definition? So if it's a jelly or a condiment, you would have the student write noun. If it's to shove or to wedge, they'd obviously write verb. To improvise music or an unstructured music, that would be verb, to jam. You could also do a semantic web. In semantic webs, you start with the first, have drowsy in the center or any word in the center, and you have them list 2 synonyms. Then list 2 antonyms, and then part of speech. And then because this word is a particular part of speech, put a word it could describe. Maybe it was the drowsy teenager, the drowsy puppy, the drowsy baby. And then have your students write a sentence using the word drowsy in their sentence. As we keep thinking about discovery activities, morphology-based, take a look at the image on the left. You see words harder, printer, softer, skater, smaller, runner, slower, trainer. See if you can come up with 2 more words, 1 word for each box that's left blank there. And as you're thinking of those words, I'd also like you to think about how you would classify these now 8 words, if you've created or thought of 2 more, into 2 categories. And I want you to give each of those categories a label. How would I categorize harder and skater if I put them in 2 different categories? Robin, let's see if anybody has thought of 2 categories that these either 6 or 8 words would fit into.
Comparisons?
Yes, we've got comparisons. There's definitely one category of comparison. So we've got harder, softer, slower. But what would your second category be then? If you're creating 2 categories from this list of 6 or 8 words, depending upon if you added 2 more to your list. 10. What about the words skater, runner, trainer? Remember, we're doing morphology. Look at that ER, the suffix ER, smaller, runner. What's the difference? If you've got a category of smaller, slower, softer, harder, and then you have a category of skater, printer, runner, trainer, what are you discovering about the ER? Well, ER can be a comparison, mean more than, but ER can also mean one who skates, one who trains, one who prints. So those are an example of a discovery activity where you're not telling the student, you're watching to see, you're giving them the instructions, put these words in 2 categories, label the categories, see what they come up with, and then you have some conversations with them. We also have another activity called a meaning continuum. In the meaning continuum, words are identified to the left of the word in the center that mean a lesser degree, and then to the right of the words in the center to a greater degree. So the word in the center is cottage. You'd have some discussion with your student. What is a cottage? Where might you find a cottage? Have you ever visited a cottage? Which fairy tale creature might have lived in a cottage? Let's see if we can come up with 3 words to a lesser degree of cottage. Go ahead and put them in the chat box. Robin, whenever you see some coming in, you can share some ideas people have.
I just got kicked out. Did you get kicked out?
Okay. So no problem, you're back. We're just looking to see if anybody in the chat box has put any words to a lesser degree of cottage.
We have cabin,
Tiny house, shack,
Tiny.
hut, small house.
Excellent. Good. Shack, maybe? And what you would want to help your students do with that meaning continuum is place them in a gradation, right? So cottage, a little less, a little less, a little less. And the same thing on the right. What would be in your list of 3 words to a greater degree of cottage? What would be your most? So on the farthest right point of your continuum, what would you have? You can put that in the chat box.
Mansion, castle.
Can we think of anything bigger than a castle?
Mansion. I've got a lot of mansions.
Mansions. Mm-hmm.
Palace, mansion.
Palace. Mm-hmm.
White House, estate.
Good. Compound.
This is shades of meaning.
Yes, so these are shades of meaning on the meaning continuum. I mean, and you can do opposite continuum, but this one is a meaning continuum that's gradient or shades of. It's a rich language discussion. It pulls in prior knowledge. It allows your students to engage in intellectual curiosity. Who might live in a cottage? Would other cultures describe a cottage the same way as we would describe a cottage? Maybe a cottage, you're up in New England and your cottage is on Kennebunk Hill and you're, this palatial kind of setting. So you can get into some beautifully rich discussion with your students in these discovery activities, thinking about words and their meanings. So what I want us is we're just going to give a few minutes to open-ended, ask any questions, feedback that you might want to share. Yes, having dyslexia does make it difficult to learn to read, but here's the good news, and you know this. Your educators, your parents, you're training the next generation of educators. You wouldn't be here today if you didn't believe this. With the right instruction, children with dyslexia can learn to read. Does it take effort? Absolutely. Does it need to be systematic and explicit with discovery learning? Yes. Can it be fun? It ought to be. Should there be wonder in the discovery and allow students to construct this knowledge with your guidance? Yes. So what questions, what feedback, any parts that you want me to go back to and highlight again, I'd be happy to do that.
I do have a question that popped up. When you have time, could you discuss reversals? How do we help students who seem to be able to who seem unable to identify the difference between B's and D's, etc.?
Yes, great question. So remember that letter reversals are typically developmentally normal up through towards the end of second grade, middle second grade. So just expect that symbol stabilization hasn't happened yet. Remember we said symbol stabilization, one of those activities where you take an actual letter shaped as the letter, place it in the student's hand, have them close their eyes, describe it, feel it, move it around. You want to help students begin to label correctly. Remember we said it's not so much a vision process of seeing it, but it's labeling it. So make sure that you're helping them with labeling through symbol stabilization. But one of the best ways to also help reduce the amount of letter reversals in writing is to engage your students in developing their cursive writing. Cursive writing and how the letters are formed, there's a difference between how you form a B and a D. And so one of the webinars that I am glad to be able to do with you later on this month is looking at dysgraphia and cursive handwriting and what that says for the brain. There's a plethora of research that says cursive handwriting is good to help reduce letter reversals as well as stimulate massive areas in the brain for language, thinking, and recall. So symbol stabilization, practice cursive writing, and practice accurate naming of the letters.
Just another question around that. I would like to know about reversals, if visuals in the classroom are helpful or a hindrance.
So I'm wondering if by visuals, like, isn't there something like a bed goes this way? I mean, I think I've seen a couple of them, whether you turn your hand one way or the other, or you've got a B for bed and the bed goes out. It's okay. It's not going to be a hindrance, but I'm not sure there's research that says it's really going to be effective. What is going to be effective is symbol stabilization, practicing the naming of the letters. So remember again, put out that alphabet soup. Have those letters there and say, find the B, find the D, find the P. And so they're identifying, they're seeing which way they're oriented, and they're pulling them out, and then using cursive writing. What I just haven't seen in the literature is support for sort of those external cueing devices that actually do help with the symbol stabilization. Haven't seen that it's a hindrance though.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Any other questions? We've got about 10 more minutes that we could spend with Kristin. And then we're going to take a short break and then join back at 10:25 to introduce our next two speakers. So a few more minutes if we have questions for Kristin. I've got a lot of thank yous.
Oh, my pleasure.
I have a question here. Will symbol stabilization help with number reversals as well?
Yes. Oh, I'm so glad you said that. Symbols are abstract and we apply meaning to them. So yes, if you've got number 3 reversals, 4 reversals, do symbol stabilization with that also. Brilliant, brilliant question.
Some comments. Beady fist is very effective when they can make the bed fist on their own fist and use it to watch as they write. Also use the cueing device along with their own fists. Only thing that's worked for 30 years of intervention. Some more thank yous. Some questions about how we can view this video in the future. And I'm going to have to ask Rose or Kim to chime in on that.
We will be sending a link out for those of you who have registered.
Thank you, Kim. Yes, Kirsten, you go ahead and chime in. She has a...
I just have one. I'm a speech language pathologist as well. I'm a structured literacy dyslexia specialist here in Idaho. And I really have a couple tricks that I really do like for the BD reversals that I found to be really effective with kids. So I just wanted to share so that everyone has another trick or tool to kind of stick in their belt. But one thing I really like is kind of like is really getting that sound symbol correspondence and giving other methods for how it can be integrated into the brain. So what I really like to talk about with kids is looking at how the symbols are formed. So looking at, there's the line and then there's the circle, or the circle and then the line, and that's the visual representation. But then I also talk to them about how we produce that sound. So when we're making a B sound, we start by pushing our lips together, and that almost draws a line. So have them look in the mirror and really see how that piece pulls together, and how they can kind of see in the mirror or within what I'm making or what they're making, that it's forming a line pretty directly with their lips if we really exaggerate it. And then as we finish that sound, it then pulls together to open up to make more of a circle with the mouth. And then kind of reversely, if we look at a D, we see the circle first and then the line. So what I like to do is, again, same thing, really show them and have them feel with their mouth what they're doing. I have them talk about it, how we really feel our tongue. We say duh, 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 we feel our tongue. And if we look at our lips never really come together and connect. So they stay a little bit open, kind of like that circle that we see with the D. So we talk about that duh, duh. We see our lips open. And then as we stop the sound and pull it together, it then draws to, it kind of stops with a line. So as I go through and have kids really analyze the B's and the D's, before I even have them tell me what sound it makes, I have them look for what they see and think about what they feel. So I just have a sheet of B's and D's on a page, and we just kind of gradually expand that into integrating that into words. But as I go through this page of just B's and D's, I have them look, and before they can even tell me anything, I have them say, what do you see? Do you see a line or do you see a circle first? And then based on that, I said, okay, now let's feel it. What do you feel? Do you feel a line or a circle? Does it make a buh sound by drawing a line with your lips? Or does it make a duh sound by keeping your lips open like the circle we see? And so I just really have them go back and forth, really feel it, see it, experience it, really pulls in that multi-sensory factor of literacy development, how they can just experience by hearing it, seeing it, feeling it. And I found that to really be the most successful strategy. I do use the bed strategy in conjunction by having them look at their fingers or their hands. I have that kind of as a backup tool so that if they just really need something else to just kind of see and get a quick glance, they have that as another visual component to help support them. But sorry, I just want to, hopefully, if anyone has any other questions, feel free to let me know. I can talk to you about it more, give you some strategies or ideas, but I just wanted to throw that out there as it's something I found to be really helpful and just really plays off of the information that Kristin's been explaining today.
Thank you, Kirsten. I appreciate it. Kirsten is a member of the Decoding Dyslexia Idaho team, so I can help connect you with her if you have further questions. There's a few more that have come up in the chat box. Kristin, how could I start phoneme counting with students who have not yet developed one-to-one correspondence for counting?
Yeah. So with phoneme counting, you could have extra manipulatives with you. So you could have blocks or felt colored squares, and that when they hear a sound, they're pulling a red square. If they hear that same sound, they're pulling a red square again. So rather than the fine motor that's required for one-to-one counting, you can have them moving an object from one place to the other, something that's a little more gross motor than the fine motor. But maybe you just start with a consonant vowel or vowel consonants or two consonants. So you're keeping it very short and simple initially. Have them clap every time they hear a different sound. So maybe you go, ba, 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 and as soon as they hear the they're clapping. So you're getting them tuned in. Rhyme, rhyme, rhyme. I didn't spend enough time talking about rhyming. Do not underestimate the power of rhyming. If your middle school, upper elementary students are rhyming and are rhyming with nonsense words, that's okay. But it kind of tells you that their word families and rhyming with real words is a little more shallow. So see if you can direct them into rhyming with real words as well. Every once in a while, nonsense words is fine, but with the littles, get them, to clap or a thumbs up every time they hear a rhyming word. We used to play, did a lot of driving in the car, so we would play automobile school, and with the daughter in the back, we'd say thumbs up, thumbs down. Which one is alike? Which one is different? Hit, 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 pit, same, different. So they're beginning to hear the sounds, and it's just auditory play. It's in a relaxed environment, but you're getting them to tune into the individual's parts of sounds in words.
Super, thanks. There's quite a few more questions.
Okay.
Any tools for helping older students with these?
With rhyming or with which activity?
That I'm not sure.
Yeah, we'll give that person a chance to
Okay.
enter in again to clarify. Yeah.
Okay. Question, do people with dyslexia possess common errors such as specific reversals, etc., or is every individual different with the struggles they have with their reading?
You know, dyslexia is individually specific, so that some readers may really struggle with fluency, but they've had lots of life experiences, that it's a vocabulary and language rich home, so comprehension may be a little bit higher. But we do see some themes across individuals with dyslexia, and that main theme seems to be the phonological awareness difficulty, that phonemic awareness, really hearing sounds and then mapping phonemes, graphemes to phonemes. There are those common tricky ones, the B's and the D's. Sometimes hearing vowel sounds can be very difficult, especially for us in the South. Where there's accents. Midwest might be different with the vowel sounds. So there is individuality, but we know from a common standpoint that phonemic awareness, phonological awareness, those are cardinal features of challenges that individuals with dyslexia have.
Super. Let's see. There's one question about what should an evaluation for dyslexia contain? And I think we might be going into that a little bit deeper too with our next two speakers, but go ahead.
For sure. Yeah, I was going to take us back to identifying and what are those aspects that we really want to find or make sure that clinical assessment includes. So certainly anything with phonological awareness, there needs to be assessment. Some tools might be the clinical evaluation of language fundamentals. There's a lot of assessment tools that speech pathologists have at their fingertips, that school psychologists have. You're going to do the rapid automatized naming. You're maybe going to do, they're going to do a receptive vocabulary test where maybe it's the Peabody picture vocabulary test where they're going to be pointing at different pictures after the examiner presents it to them. There's going to be some phonics in there. There's also going to be decoding both real and nonsense words. And the reason being for nonsense words is you want to make sure, and in nonsense words, you can tell, are they applying grapheme, phoneme, that sound symbol correspondence? Oral reading fluency, spelling is a very sensitive indicator of dyslexia, as well as writing. And remember, individuals with dyslexia have average to above average intelligence. These are individuals who can be great thinkers, are often very good seeing in a different way the world around them, in solving problems. So these are individuals where there can be twice exceptionality, there can be great giftedness in other areas. It's just this language-based literacy piece is a sticking point for them.
Great. If a child can identify the initial sounds of two words, but can't say if they are the same or different, what could be the cause of this?
So if they can identify that the sounds are the same, so maybe it's sun and soup, or no, you're saying they can identify that it's an S and an S, but they can't tell if it's the same or different. First, you'd want to make sure that auditory discrimination, you'd want to make sure that they're hearing the differences or similarities in sounds, but then you also want to make sure, is it a conceptual understanding of what is same or different? So check out auditory discrimination and then check out conceptual understanding, put up a tree and a car. Are these, the same or different, so that you can tell that child, that young one understands the conceptual meaning of same or different.
Super. If I've missed anything in the chat box, you're welcome to unmute your mic and jump in. I know that over the month of October, we are offering those webinars weekly, and we will be taking a deeper dive. Our first webinar is with Connie Rizzer, local to Idaho, the director of the Joshua Institute, and she'll be addressing dyslexia instruction in small group settings, special ed specific. And then next we have Kirsten Lewis, who spoke just a moment ago, our speech language pathologist, and she will go more into depth on the phonological awareness for K through third and for older, and that'll be on the 14th. And then we get to see Kristin again on the 21st, I believe it is, where she's going to help us learn more about dysgraphia. Decoding Dyslexia sent out a questionnaire to the educators that have attended previous conferences, and the #1 request was what is dyslexia, and learning more, which thank you, Kristin, you took us there today. And then #2 was screening in the classroom and how to address and read effectively the Istation data, which is a testing that's used out here in Idaho, which we'll get into next with our next 2 speakers. And then dysgraphia. There was a lot of interest in learning about dysgraphia. So Kristin will join us again the 3rd week of October, the 21st, to take us into learning more about dysgraphia. And then last, we have 2 members of the Decoding Dyslexia team, Dr. Kim Zadel and Jordan Atnip, a special education teacher here in Idaho. And they're going to talk about dyslexia for the older grades, 4th grade and beyond. What can it look like, and talk maybe a bit more about accommodations and things. Let me just review real quickly the chat box. It looks like there's just some great conversation happening, so hopefully you guys are sharing and reading through that. I think now's a great time to take a quick wiggle break. I really want to thank you, Kristin, for being with us today. Wonderful information. I truly appreciate you. Thank you so much. We are going to take a break. Thank you. Everyone take a quick wiggle break, and then let's come back maybe in 5 minutes or so, and I'll introduce our next 2 speakers, and we'll dive into screening in the classroom and how to read the Istation data. Thank you. Helps if I unmute myself. Okay, I'm not sure if everyone's back, and we're ready to move on with our next 2 speakers. Oh, I see them. Okay, they're here. Okay, I'll go ahead and introduce who's going to join us now. We've got Dr. Sally Brown. She's currently an assistant professor in the Department of Education at the College of Idaho. She has dedicated her career to incorporating effective instructional practices to meet the needs of diverse learners. She has approximately 8 years of experience as a classroom teacher, working with at-promise students, and 10 years of experience training pre-service teachers. Dr. Brown uses knowledge she's gained in the classroom to guide her research and teacher training courses. She received her master's degree in special education from the University of Virginia and her doctorate degree in specializing in curriculum and instruction with a literacy concentration at Utah State University. She is also a mom of a kiddo with dyslexia, a son with dyslexia here in the West Ada School District, and has become a dear friend of mine and a member of the SEEP panel, the Special Education Advisory Panel that we both sit on, excuse me, at the State Department of Ed. Also joining us today is Alayna Knop. She is from the Idaho State Department of Education, where she is our English Language Arts and Literacy Assessment Coordinator. Alayna's been in education for 17 years, earning a master's degree in curriculum and instruction with an emphasis in literacy. She's also a nationally board certified teacher in reading and literacy in early through middle childhood. Alayna has worked with students K through 12 as a classroom teacher and intervention specialist. She was also trained and worked as a district dyslexia specialist. Joins us with 2 sons with dyslexia. I'm very grateful for both of you. Thank you for coming and joining us today. We're excited to hear more about screening in a classroom and how to read the data.
Thank you, Robin. I am so happy to be here, and I'm so grateful that you all joined us. I'd rather be in person for sure, but the gift of technology is that we have many others that couldn't be here this morning that are going to access this later. So I'm super excited that we can get the word out and provide solid information for teachers. I just wanted to start with a little personal vignette per se. I think being a mom of a child with dyslexia that struggled with reading and writing since kindergarten puts a little bit different take on what I do in my professional world. And I have a lot of experiences that have been very disheartening in instruction. And so that's why I'm so passionate about getting the right knowledge to teachers and also to parents to find out what you can do and what questions you can ask. Now, we've designed this presentation really for general education teachers and how to use data in their classrooms. However, we know we have a very wide audience, special educators and also parents and district folks and principals, administrators. So please put in the chat questions you have. And what I always tell my students at College of Idaho is that secondary folks do need to understand early reading instruction. And usually at the college setting, they don't get a lot of that because they're focused on learning their content. And everything you know about early reading instruction impacts what you do in the classroom and how you can integrate stronger reading and writing practices within your classroom. Alayna, do you have kind of an introductory note you want to add?
Yeah, good morning or afternoon, everyone, depending on your time zone. I would just agree with what Sally said. Thank you for your time. We know we have a diverse audience. Hopefully I can really give you some insight into the assessments that we use statewide for our K-3 students in particular, and tie that back to what Kristin shared today about how we might screen kiddos. So please interact with us in the chat and let us know if you have questions.
All right, thank you. And just a little heads up, we are going to be turning off our cameras while we're sharing our screen, but when we're answering and having questions, we'll turn them back on.
And can we ask that everyone turn off their cameras, please, and make sure your mics are muted? Thank you.
Okay, first off, I would like to have you write in the chat. Just take about a minute to introduce yourself so we know who we have joining us live this morning. And then please answer the following questions. So what assessment or assessments is currently being used in all K-3 classrooms in the state of Idaho as a screener to identify students not meeting reading benchmarks? Number 2, does this assessment provide diagnostic data? And then on a scale from 1 to 5, rate your knowledge of these assessments. 1, nothing at all. 5, expert knowledge. So take about a minute.
We've got educational therapists, special ed teachers, SLPs, a mom of a severely dyslexic son, special education director in Nebraska, educational therapist, first grade, school psychologist, K through 3rd special ed teacher, grandparent and volunteer. I'm a SPED teacher at, oh my gosh, they're just coming in. I'm not reading fast enough. Reading specialist at a private school, grandparent and volunteer. We've got a principal here with us today at our middle school here in West Ada. He's interested in age-appropriate instruction strategy for middle school students. Special education teacher, IRI, classroom teacher, reading specialist.
Okay, great. Thank you. Great variety here. And your experiences and background add to the discussion. So please, again, feel free. Just waiting for a couple of responses on your knowledge of assessments in the state of Idaho.
We also have a clinical psychologist with us today.
Excellent. Welcome.
Got some questions coming in. A special ed director for virtual high schools wondering what assessments are best for high school students with dyslexia. We've got Istation, yes, 3, lots of 3.
Okay, so kind of in the middle of the road. So some basic knowledge, and hopefully by the end of this, you can say 4 or 5. And if you're starting at a 1 or 2, or you're a parent and you even haven't heard this terminology before, hopefully you can leave with being able to understand it and interpret the results a little bit. Thank you so much. Okay, so we have some challenges here in our nation and the state, and I always like to begin kind of by putting out those challenges for us, because we are in the education field, or we're parents, educators. We need to know, and maybe sometimes be a little shocked to know what we need to do to improve our classroom instruction and using assessment to really drive instruction. So I'm sharing the National Association of Educational Progress results with you here. And it is a test that is given to students across the United States. Not all students take this assessment, but it provides us a window into what students can do in different content areas. So for 4th grade, we see Idaho here in the yellow gold kind of line, and then the national scores down below. We're slightly ahead nationally, but what this means is approximately 37% of 4th graders in Idaho performed at or above NAEP's proficient level. So proficient reading. So what is proficient reading? Here is an example. I'm not going to read this whole paragraph, but you can go back to take a look at it later to kind of understand what is proficient in NAEP's description. So a student that can read proficiently should be able to integrate, interpret text, and apply their understanding, meaning identify main ideas, locate relevant information in a text, combine information from various texts to gather overall information. We know that as students get older, they have to do this more and more in the classroom. So if they are not successfully being able to decode words, they cannot do this advanced level thinking. And it's really not even advanced. This is considered proficient. Advanced is even greater skills in this area. So here is kind of a comparison over the years between Idaho and the nation. We perform pretty much about the same as the nation. We have, if you look at the proficient level and the advanced level, that's where I got the 37%. That's the students that have reached proficient level based on this measure. And then if you look at the nation as a whole and look at the percentage of students that reached basic level and above, we're at 69%. So basically, and basic is below proficient, 40% of our students at the 4th grade level are not meeting basic or proficient level as measured on the NAEP assessments. So this is problematic. Like we need to know what we need to do in order to move the bar. We have done increasingly better over the years. We've made small gains. But unfortunately, this year, there was a bigger gap between students with disabilities and typically developing students. So why is this important to early reading instruction? First off, we know it's essential for student success. Students have to be better and better readers the older they get. Teaching reading is really complex. So sometimes in my courses, in my beginning course, I have students say, wow, I did not really understand that teaching reading is this complex and difficult. Many people in the world don't understand all of the components it takes to teach someone to read. As Dr. Barbour mentioned, there are so many different areas that we have to attend to, and it's not a natural process. So students that have dyslexia or other reading difficulties are starting at a place where they have holes in a lot of these areas. If we don't understand that big picture, then we're missing the opportunity to intervene. We need to use assessment data to improve instruction. So teachers need to be able to identify students with difficulties and use classroom instruction to fill those gaps. Now, I also like to start with the NAEP data because that's where using assessment. We're looking at assessment and saying, where is our problems? Do we have problems? Yes. We still have many of our students, 40% of our students, not meeting NAEP proficiency level.
So we want to take you now to Idaho specific data and really think about answering some important questions about where are our students in Idaho performing, specifically when we think about the Idaho Reading Indicator that includes all of those early reading skills and a lot of assessment on the skills that we learned about this morning. Let me take you to the data. So let's think about the Idaho Reading Indicator data. This data is presented from fall 2018 to spring 2019. So this is not last year's data, unfortunately, because of COVID, we weren't able to complete our spring 2020 assessment and have reportable valid data. So we're looking at the prior school year, the 18-19 school year. And you can see here that for Idaho students, there is growth from fall to spring. We see growth in kindergarten, in first grade, in second grade, also in third grade, but that growth slows, you can see, by third grade. So let's talk about the subtests that are included in the data that I just shared with you. So in Idaho, our Idaho Reading Indicator is an assessment created by Istation. Many of you use the term IRI and Istation synonymously, as you should. Our IRI is by Istation. So in kindergarten, the subtests or the skills that we're measuring students on are listening comprehension. So there's your language component. Phonological and phonemic awareness is being assessed in kindergarten. We're assessing letter knowledge for kindergartners, both recognition of the letter and of the sound. We're also assessing vocabulary beginning in kindergarten, and that's a subtest that you'll see throughout all of the grade levels K-3. First grade, again, we're assessing phonological and phonemic awareness, letter knowledge, vocabulary, but we're adding some skills for first grade, and we're beginning to assess students in alphabetic decoding. And alphabetic decoding in IRI by Istation is that nonsense word fluency. Students' ability to simply map a phoneme and a grapheme without having context of what that real word might be. So that's a really important indicator, particularly for students with dyslexia. We're also looking at reading comprehension beginning in first grade and spelling. We heard a lot in our first presentation this morning about that importance of spelling. So that assessment begins in first grade. Second and third grade then continues with 4 of the assessments that first graders saw. We have vocabulary, reading comprehension, spelling, and text fluency. I also want folks to know that our IRI by Istation is a computer adaptive test. So when we're assessing students in these main components of reading, the assessment is adapting and giving them more complex questions within each of these domains to really find out what students know and can do. And when a student struggles, a second grader or a third grader in particular, we might see them be given an alphabetic decoding subtest. That's going to give us some really good data to tell us where these students are struggling and start to identify potentially those early signs of dyslexia. Questions or comments about the subtests in IRI?
I don't see anything coming through on the chat right now.
All right, let's talk about this idea of using our IRI data to think about how we might screen students, how we might use the data in a diagnostic way to really know where to start our reading instruction, particularly at those early grades. We know how important it is to intervene for students with dyslexia as early as possible, as early as kindergarten, if our screening data indicates that there may be the weaknesses that are then associated with dyslexia. Also want to talk about progress monitoring and benchmarking. You can see on the slide that the IRI by Istation gives us information in each of these types of assessment. It can be used as a screener, can be used as a diagnostic tool, a progress monitoring tool. Not the only one, certainly. Sally's going to go into detail later in our presentation about other measures that you could use, but certainly because IRI is administered to every K-3 student in our state, we want to start with that data and we want to look at it really intentionally and think about the characteristics of dyslexia and how our IRI could give us an indication that a student might be struggling.
And Alayna, would you mind just talking about the difference between a screener and a diagnostic measure?
Absolutely. So a screener is going to be an assessment that gives you kind of a wide overview of where a group of students or a particular student is performing. So taking that overall score you can see on the slide, that overall score, is my student a tier 1, a tier 2, or tier 3? That's kind of a high level screener of where that student falls in comparison to other students in their same grade nationwide. Diagnostic then is going to be digging into that student's overall score and the subtest scores that came together to give them the overall score and noticing, hey, this student is struggling in letter knowledge, but they're pretty high in alphabetic decoding. What might that indicate to me could be their need? So diagnosing where the gap might be or where the weakness might be for that student. Would you add anything, Sally?
Yeah, I think that's a great definition, differentiating between the two. Diagnostic is really telling us as educators what we need to do. So it's narrowing in and telling us where we need to begin instruction. And just for some of those that you may not know the difference of tier 1, tier 2, and tier 3, tier 1, we're looking at benchmark, whole classroom instruction is being effective for these students. Tier 2, they need some structured, explicit, systematic instruction in those areas that are difficult for them or they're not meeting benchmarks. And then tier 3 would be even need more intense and severe instruction.
Great, that's exactly right. And we're going to get into that a little bit on our next slides. So let's think about IRI as a screening assessment. So in Idaho, our definition for a screener is that it's given before instruction and that it's used to inform teachers on where to begin that core instruction that all kids receive. It's also going to tell you how to think about differentiating your instruction for small groups and even for individual students. So I like to give teachers and folks that I work with some questions that they can think about when they look at the IRI by Istation data as a screener. And we know, particularly with students who might show signs of dyslexia, screening is really, really important. So we want to think about, as we look at that screening data, what percentage of students are performing in that low risk, some risk, and high risk area in each of our grade levels or in our classroom in general. We want to look at that tie to instruction. If we see in our screening data that we have a group of first grade students that really struggle with phonemic awareness, that's an indicator that phonemic awareness instruction needs to be provided in a really systematic, explicit way so that the gap for those students doesn't get greater, and so that those students can get those really key early literacy skills. We also want to look at it on the other side and think about areas where our students might be performing, you know, on the high end. Sometimes the vocabulary scores are really high, and it's imperative that while we work with students to close their gaps, we also give them the rich language and vocabulary that they need. And I heard it mentioned more than once this morning that your typical dyslexic student is a high intelligence student, and we just have one piece of the brain, maybe the language center, maybe the decoding area, that just isn't, you know, quite syncing with the other areas, which is really what leads us to that diagnosis of dyslexia. So we want to be very sensitive to dyslexic students who might be struggling phonologically, but be very strong in another area, in comprehension or vocabulary. And we want to support them to build those areas together by thinking about what we can implement in our classrooms that's going to help our students. When we think about IRI as a diagnostic tool, a diagnostic assessment being given at any time we see an indication on a screener that a student may be struggling, we want to diagnose. We want to get that exact, precise information about that student's skill, knowledge, that's going to inform the interventions that we're going to deliver to students. We want to ask questions like, what is a student's performance compared to the grade level target? What is their gap? Then we want to ask, and this is probably, the next two questions are probably the most important questions that I can think of and that I utilized in my practice when I supported students with dyslexia in my work in Texas as a dyslexia specialist. We have to identify the skills that that student shows a weakness in, and where do those skills lie on the hierarchy of reading. If we have a student that's weak in listening comprehension and letter knowledge, we have to be really intentional in thinking through that connection between language and the phoneme grapheme work that would come with knowing your letters and then encoding and decoding. And we have to know we can't skip over that language comprehension weakness and go straight to phonics instruction to get the letter knowledge up. We have to meld the two. Really takes a deep understanding of the hierarchy of teaching reading and the development that students go through as they learn to read, that science of reading that was so eloquently shared with us this morning. Also really want to look at that strength again when we think about diagnostic, not just in terms of subtests, but also in the ways that students learn. Is a student more of a visual learner? We want to think of those modalities: tactile, visual, sensory. Multi-sensory approaches are really effective for students with dyslexia, and oftentimes our diagnostic data can give us an indication of what modality students might learn best within when we do deliver that systematic, direct, explicit instruction.
Alayna, I just have a thought there that I wanted to share, a little experience that might play to that point that you're talking about, is using that student strength and identifying the student strengths. So in one of my courses, I teach a literacy assessment and intervention course. And this semester, we have the opportunity to virtually tutor students. And it's a challenge for sure. And we have one student that has been severely struggling since pre-kindergarten. She's been receiving additional services since the age of 3 or 4. And during the first 3 sessions, she was in tears the entire session. We were running some assessments virtually. The person is not with her. My student is not with her, so it's already difficult. And when she has felt that she has never been able to demonstrate something she can do well when it comes to reading and writing, she doesn't want to do it. She cries. And a third grader, and she's still working on very basic phonological skills and also reading CVC words. And finally, this last session, she made it through the whole session without crying. And it started with her being able to read a memorized book. She has a good memory in replaying that book that she's been over a million times, and it made her feel confident. She's also a really good listener. And so the tutor was able to share a story with her, and she could listen to this language and to this story. Once they were able to make that connection, and now every session she reads to this student, so she can just listen and enjoy a good book, and then start working on some of the skills that she has difficulty with. She's also made it very visual, and she's trying some multisensory things, even though they're not together, it was nice to see that progress. And so sometimes just peeking in and using that strength can be really beneficial for older students.
Yes, I love that. And I love the language aspect, because we assess that, right? For all of our kindergartners, we give them a language comprehension assessment. We also have this ability in our IRI program to notice a third or fourth grader that might be struggling and administer them a lower level subtest. We call it an on-demand. So if I had a third grader and I suspected, like you described, Sally, that maybe her language was really high and a strength, I could administer that language comprehension assessment to that kiddo, and I could have the data to really make a database decision and use it as a diagnostic tool. That's a great connection. So now I want to think about progress monitoring, and progress monitoring being the administration of an assessment more frequently throughout instruction and intervention. So what progress monitoring does is twofold. It gives us an indication of student progress toward mastery of the concepts and the skills, but it's also an indication of how effective the teaching is for that student. Oftentimes, teachers forget to ask themselves, is the instruction I'm providing adequate to meet the needs of the student? Have I diagnosed what the student needs in an appropriate way? I want to see if my student is at or above the target, and if they're making adequate growth to the core instruction or the tier 2 or tier 3 interventions, but it may not always be the student that the progress monitoring data can point to. Sometimes it can point to your instructional practices, and I go back to what we talked about this morning when we think about even spelling, and the example of the gumball phonics was a great example, right? If that's my intervention and I'm doing all this great identification of syllable types, that is great. But if the student needs that language, if my diagnostic data showed weaknesses in language and I'm not incorporating the language and the rich practice that a student would get from decoding those words after they've color coded them, then my instruction might not be direct and explicit enough for the diagnostic data that showed me that student needs language practice.
I have a question here.
I see. Can children who are homeschooled or attending a private school take the IRI by Istation? Unfortunately, the contract that the state has for IRI only extends to public schools. Certainly wouldn't be out of the question for a parent of a homeschool child to reach out to the State Department of Education and say, hey, I would like my student to have a license. Can't guarantee the answer would be yes, but I am hopeful that the answer would be yes. I know homeschooled students have access to our 3rd through 8th grade state assessment. So giving them access to the K3, IRI would be a pretty high probability. That's a great question, Kim. So now I just want to give you just a quick glance at the IRI reports that are available in the IRI by Istation system and connect those to the type of assessment data that they might provide us. So the executive summary report really is a screening report that gives us that overview of where students are performing in terms of their grade level peers. Are they a tier 1 and they're at grade level? Are they a tier 2 and they're below? Or are they a tier 3 and they're significantly below? The summary report drills down a little deeper and again as a screener, it gives us subtest results. It looks at those subtests of vocabulary, letter knowledge, phonemic awareness, fluency, alphabetic decoding. We then have some reports that work as progress monitoring reports. We have a skill growth report that teachers have access to that really tells you how much growth students are making at the skill level, and is that growth enough to support them to reach the target and to fill their gap? That's a really important question that report can give us some insight into. We have a student summary report that can be used as a screener and as a diagnostic. And you'll find in the handouts, and those were posted in the chat, you'll find a report if you're a parent or even if you're a teacher and you haven't seen this report. I went ahead and included the student summary handout detailed report that talks about all of the information that's included on that report that a parent should receive and that a teacher should be looking at and talking through with parents and other educators at the school in order to design the rich, targeted intervention that a student, particularly a student with dyslexia, is going to need access to very early. We also have a priority report that is a screener and kind of at the very surface level maps lesson plans at a skill level to a student's need. So if my student performs below grade level in letter knowledge, that priority report is going to identify lesson plans that the teacher can access within Istation to provide letter knowledge support to that student. The lesson plans are very multisensory. Again, we want to make sure we think about best practice. There's no curriculum in the world that is perfect. So please think about how to use the lessons from Istation if you're a teacher in the best way for the student by looking at that diagnostic data. Diagnostic data is available in that session activity detail report. We can dive into our student reporting, and for one student, I can look at their phonemic awareness subtest and I can see, are they getting CVC words? Are they at the CVCE level? I can actually identify the syllable type that they're seeing within their alphabetic decoding or phonemic awareness subtests, whether the phonemic awareness that's an auditory test, the alphabetic decoding is then phoneme grapheme matching. I can identify where they are being assessed in the computer adaptive assessment so I know where to start my instruction. And then that rate of improvement report can be looked at for individual students as well as classes and grades to show us, is the rate of improvement great enough to fill that student's gap? Because we know in the research, and it was mentioned this morning, that really if students are behind at third grade, we kind of hit this critical wall. We really don't want to send third graders on without having the early reading skills that they need, because the likelihood that they're going to catch up is very, very low. So I want to share with you, this has been a very high level IRI overview. I know many of you who are teachers on this call have been involved in IRI. If you're parents, please ask the questions that I've shared of your teachers and of your schools. But there is training out there for teachers. We have an implementation mini-series that we offer through Edmodo. It's a course that you can also receive graduate credit for taking through NNU. All you have to do is go to Edmodo and sign up. I've put the class code on the screen, so you would just enter that and it would take you right to our course. We offer it in the fall and in the spring. We also have pre-recorded training vignettes for teachers that help them understand how to administer the IRI, how to utilize some of the modeling features, how to make sure it's accessible for students who might have a disability already identified. And we want to make sure that what data we're getting is good data and that they've taken that assessment in a way that they were able to show what they know. We also want to know about the data and the reporting. And I see Kim's comment, and I'm going to reiterate that in big flashing letters. Please don't retain a third grader who is dyslexic. Research shows it doesn't help. And we are very fortunate to be in Idaho because we do not retain third graders who don't meet a proficiency level. But I can tell you about half of the states have legislation that says that if a third grader is not proficient on the third grade assessment, they are automatically retained. And that just breaks my heart. So we're very lucky here in Idaho that that is not a legislative mandate. And Rose said, how about older students? Is the IRI available to guide their instruction? So the IRI by Istation that is provided by the state is a K-3 assessment. Istation does also offer a 4-8 assessment. So that many districts have purchased that, but that wouldn't come from the state. That would be a district's purchase.
So as a classroom teacher, that is definitely one thing that you could ask your districts, if that is something that your district has purchased, or is there something additional that they have purchased that you can use to diagnose?
Absolutely.
Screen and diagnose.
Yep, and I would add that ask if what they're using is going to test those key areas. Is it going to test phonemic awareness? Is it going to test letter knowledge? We need 4th and 5th graders who are struggling to have the right assessment. And Sally's going to provide a ton of other assessment ideas for you to take forward with you. Any questions that I can answer about the IRI or the data that it provides before I turn it back over to Sally?
Yes, please feel free. We'll take a little pause here for a moment because we'll shift from going from IRI by Istation to other assessments that we can pair with these to help us really diagnose and identify areas for students that have characteristics of dyslexia and other difficulties.
Is the IRI by Istation customized for Idaho, or is the Istation testing the same across states? That's a great question. Istation is an off-the-shelf product, so our IRI by Istation is not customized for Idaho. The norms within it are national norms, but I can share with the group that as a state, we have partnered with Johns Hopkins as well as Boise State, and we are looking at specifically how do Idaho students perform on the IRI by Istation. So once we have 2 years of growth data, right now we only have 18-19 fall to spring. We don't have 19-20. Once we have 2 years of data, we'll really be diving into how Idaho students perform. I also see is the data for IRI is accurate for 4th through 8th grade as it is for the younger grades. You know, I can't speak to the accuracy of the data. My experience with the 4th through 8th grade Istation program comes from my work in Texas, where I was a dyslexia specialist and we used the 4-8 program for students. I can tell you at that time, it was frustrating to assess a 4th grader and have a report that said below grade level and not be able to see the basic skills. My understanding from Istation is they are working to make their product from K-8 seamless. So that will be a lot more accurate, I think, for 4th through 8th graders to use Istation and have data that's appropriate and gives us the younger grades early reading skills. Does IRI or Istation 4-8 identify subskills? The 4-8 assessment, as far as I'm aware, really focuses on vocabulary and comprehension, as well as the fluency and the spelling, but doesn't include those early reading skills. So that would be where we shift, right, from a 4-8 screener to a 4-8 diagnostic, and make sure we're using a diagnostic tool that would give us the phonemic awareness and the phonics and the language scores that we need to really look at a student who may have characteristics of dyslexia. If they've not been identified by 4th grade, we want to make sure we're diagnosing with an assessment that includes it. And I don't, Kim, know the cost. I have the number for 100,000 students from our state contract in my brain, but student cost, I don't know. I'm not seeing any other questions in the chat, so I'm going to turn it back over to you, Sally.
All right, thank you. Okay, so we've talked a little bit about how we are using Istation to identify and screen students that are having difficulty. So I wanted to provide just a snapshot. This is from the IDA Dyslexia Handbook, the International Dyslexia Association, who are kind of known as the gurus of dyslexia. And the handbook is written for families and parents, so it's very, very helpful. I've put the full citation at the end of our slides and also on our handout. So feel free in your time to look at that. I've pulled the early childhood primary grades kind of indicators and also the middle grades in high school. So you'll see that there is a, excuse me for one moment. Let me get back to my slide there, and I'm going to turn off my camera so we can see the full slide. So you'll see that difficulty with rhyming, blending sounds, learning the alphabet, linking letters with those sounds is one of those early indicators. Moving over to middle grades and high school, reluctant readers, slow word by word reading. So you'll notice that in fluency measures. Spelling is one of those huge indicators. Students with dyslexia have very difficulty spelling and learning word patterns, and listening comprehension can be really, really strong and solid. And oftentimes, even with my son, he is great at comprehension, and even if he decodes some of the words on the page incorrectly, he is still be able to get the gist of what he's reading. So older students learn to compensate and really use their strengths for things they have difficulty doing. I love this quote, and this article is actually posted on the International Dyslexia Association site. While a diagnosis of dyslexia currently requires repeated failure learning to read, this does not mean that early signs of dyslexia cannot be observed in preschool or even possibly earlier. Deficits in phonological awareness, rapid automatized naming, verbal working memory, and letter knowledge have been shown to be robust precursors of dyslexia in children as young as age 3. So this is promising to us because we can actually identify students that have these characteristics and really intensify instruction in our classroom so that we can hopefully make up some of those gaps. And ideally, children with really strong explicit instruction in all of those systematic skills in each one of these areas won't need special education at grade 4. That is really the ideal, is let's intervene early so there are less students being served under special education that are dyslexic. So areas to assess for students with characteristics of dyslexia, Dr. Barbour also highlighted these as well. So concepts of print, oral language, phonological processing, alphabetics, rapid automatic naming, orthographic processing, meaning spelling, processing speed, working memory, decoding and phonics, vocabulary, fluency, comprehension, writing, spelling. It's a very exhaustive list. And as a classroom teacher, we're not necessarily going to hit all of them, but we should be hitting the majority of them. And things like rapid automatic naming to use the normed measures and such, there is not, that I know of, a free measure to do that, but being able for a child to be able to name their colors quickly, name letters quickly, those are all tasks associated with rapid automatic naming. And we'll come back and show you examples of what some of these look like. I pulled specific examples of different diagnostic assessments, formative assessments that we can use in the classroom that can give us some information on where to start instruction. So I pulled this from the Mississippi Department of Education site. It's called Finding the Right Starting Point for Interventions. What I found with my students at College of Idaho and new teachers is that it is really a difficult skill to learn how to take assessment data and decide where I'm going to start instruction, especially when I have a classroom of 30 students. So I've given them the IRI by Istation screener. I have the data in front of me. I now have maybe a third of my students not meeting benchmark. What do I do from there? So this is, I love how this graphic really can kind of spell it out for us of what the next steps are in my assessment, comprehensive assessment plan. So beginning of the year, screener, the individuals meet the benchmark, proceed to tier 1 instruction. Good core classroom instruction. If they're receiving that, this student should continually to do well. So look at the next box. It's beginning of year screener falls below recognized benchmark for phonological awareness. Okay, we need to proceed to informal phonological awareness assessment using a PA scope and sequence to identify the lowest deficit skill. So I want us to keep that in mind throughout, that we're really trying to identify that lowest deficit skill. That's why in older grades, it becomes very difficult to decide what assessment should I give the student, because if they're poor comprehenders, I have to back up and see if what is the skill that they're missing and where do I need to be intervening, or are there multiple areas? I do have some comments over in the chat, so I want to pop over there for a moment. I've found in testing some students may do well in all areas of reading except reading comprehension, and further testing showed ADD and ADHD. Good point. Yes, there are some clinical evaluations that we don't provide as teachers that are going to give further information and be able to identify exactly what's going awry with the student. I think it's important to realize if a child isn't reported as dyslexic or the word is not being said in schools, the data would be skewed. We need to say the word, support these kiddos, and report the accuracy of the data. My child excels at comprehension when read to, but is unable to decode basic language. Was told it was an eye problem. We have to test and report accurately. It was not an eye problem. I'd like to ask, if we are lucky to live in Idaho, why are we not saying the word dyslexia? I am so glad you brought that up, Michael. It is essential in our opinion, and DDID, Decoding Dyslexia Idaho, is on the mission to use dyslexia in our state and in the schools. So we have the IRI by Istation screener already in place. Many states throughout the nation, I think, is it 9, Alayna, that have identified Istation as an appropriate screener for dyslexia?
Yes.
Okay, thank you. So that we are using it. So we do have a screener in place. Do we need more information and assessment to really fill our comprehensive assessment plan? Yes, we do. So hopefully after this, you'll have a little bit of a take on how to do that, to pair with your other data. Our next step is getting legislation in the state of Idaho using the word dyslexia. And believe you me, there's many people working feverishly on that and other things in the area in our state to really make this a word we feel comfortable using and know what it means. And as was mentioned before, and Alayna mentioned this in her section talking about the IRI, is that if students are showing characteristics of dyslexia, we're not necessarily immediately out of the gate giving them a full battery from a psychologist. We want to do other formative assessments that can tell us, where can I intervene? If they are not making growth, then yes, that's why we have to do assessments, check-ins, and check if they're growing or if not. And if not, we need to move into that more comprehensive evaluation through our school psychologists, or many parents end up doing that privately, which is very costly and can be frustrating as well. So believe you me, we need more people in our court helping with this work. So if you're interested, please contact Robin. She has been working on this longer than I have, but I joined as soon as I found out about her and Decoding Dyslexia Idaho. And so I'm really hoping that we can move in that direction. And I feel there's many people in our state that also want that same thing. I see a couple more comments.
Yeah, and I can chime in too.
Please do.
From a state perspective, I don't disagree with you that we absolutely need to bring this word to the forefront. Unfortunately, currently, it is included in our special education manual, but it's under the category of specific learning disability. And given that we now have this robust screening tool that states are recognizing as appropriate for screening for dyslexia, we need to bring that language in, and we need to point this out to students, because one of the other chats, says we need to let educators know Istation is a good screener for dyslexia. And I completely agree. We have to come to this place now where we used to test for words read per minute. And that was the extent after kindergarten to how we assess students' early literacy. And now we have this robust assessment, and it's about merging the assessment with the knowledge. And that's why these conferences are so important. And I want to be a part of them, because this gives teachers the knowledge to say, we need to merge these things. We need to bring them together.
Thank you, Alayna. And maybe you can also speak to the comment about the comprehension piece in Istation, that the time task doesn't reveal maybe a true comprehension measure.
I get a lot of questions about the time constraints in Istation. Those of you that have administered it or are parents and have seen your students take it this fall at home, it does have very tight time, and that's intentional. And I think it would align to a lot of the research in terms of how a screener should function. The research would tell us that automaticity is so important in fluent reading. We saw the graphic this morning that fluency is the bridge to comprehension. So oftentimes, and this is where diagnostic data comes in, when the comprehension is low, we really need to diagnose and look at all the language and the decoding skills, because it's decoding and language that come together to give us comprehension. And I think now we have assessment data that we can dig into. We just need to teach teachers how to dig into it.
And something else that you can ask as a parent, and say that your student is an older third grader and older student in third grade, and the comprehension measure is indicating comprehension problems. Ask the teacher to administer additional comprehension measures. They know how to do that. And so then you have that little bit of information. So maybe the automaticity isn't there, but when the student is given time, they can comprehend a text. So that becomes really critically important when we're looking at accommodations for students in special education as well. So an important piece is knowing kind of those questions to ask, and ask teachers, ask administrators, so that they can have a better understanding of your child and where the deficits are, and then how that informs the instruction in the classroom.
Yes, data is so important in helping teachers understand. I agree with you, Robin, how to effectively use what's accessible from SDE. we provide a lot of training, and it's bringing that together for parents. So thank you for inviting me today to start that process.
Thank you, Alayna, and thank you for your comments coming in. This little table, we looked at what is available to our teachers in the state, and so my goal was to really include things that are easily accessible to you and are free and at low cost. So you'll notice there are many assessments listed from the core assessment measures text, because I've seen this in schools in several different districts. The Teaching Reading Source Book by Core, and then the Assessing Reading Multiple Measures manual that is kind of its accompanying book has several different measures in several of these areas. So if you have access to that, or if that's one I would personally purchase, then it is a very helpful manual and document to use in further diagnostic testing. Like I mentioned before, for rapid automatic naming, there are limited normed measures available at this point to teachers, but your school psychologists have access to the CTOP. And so this would be one area. The reason we include this when we're specifically looking at students with characteristics of dyslexia before they've been identified is that it is a predictor of later reading success. And many students that have dyslexia struggle with rapid automatic naming, that automaticity. So this I included in the handout as well as kind of a go-to when you're looking specifically to assess a certain area for a student and pair it with that Istation data. Now for older students that you don't have that Istation data, what can you do? And I've seen that come up in the chat a couple of times. So starting with phonological awareness, a phoneme awareness measure is in the core text, and it's a phoneme segmentation test. So if you're specifically, and there's others out there, so you can assess older students for phoneme segmentation. Phonemic awareness is the most challenging skill under that phonological awareness umbrella. So being able to manipulate the sounds, count sounds in words, replace sounds with new sounds to create new words, it's a very difficult task. And with our students in the intervention course, we have some students that are tutoring older students, 4th, 5th, 6th, 7th grade is our oldest one this semester. But we have given them the phoneme segmentation test. And it's interesting, students that did poorly on that formative assessment also did poorly on which assessment? What would you say? Go ahead and put it in the chat. If they are doing poorly on phonemic awareness, where are you seeing that direct correlation? Okay, fluency is an answer that I see. Phonics, reading and spelling. Spelling, spelling, spelling. Spelling is the key one that it is just so interesting. I can look at it as child's phonemic awareness measure and just know, I bet they have a difficulty time spelling. Some of those same students actually also are poor decoders of multisyllabic words. So they're okay in beginning reading skills, but as soon as those multisyllabic words come into place and they have to decode these words that have multiple parts, their decoding, they struggle and they start guessing, as Dr. Barbour mentioned. And so then their accuracy goes down, their comprehension, their fluency goes down, so it becomes a ripple effect. But that spelling is really a key one, that phonemic and awareness and spelling have difficulty. Yes, and I am aware that districts often have no money, schools have no money, teachers pay out of their own pockets for a lot of materials, as I did and still do to this day. So that's why I was on a mission to find things that were inexpensive and easily accessible. So here's one example of how we can use additional diagnostic assessment to kind of really target instruction. So this is an example from the core text: sentence segmentation, syllable segmentation, and phoneme segmentation, and phoneme deletion. So the most basic skill is listed at the top, and the most advanced skills are listed at the bottom. So this is real data from a student. And sentence segmentation, solid. Syllable segmentation, struggled. Benchmark, strategic, intensive. Intensive is the tier 3 kind of level, so needing a lot of intervention at that point. So looking at this, and then beginning of the year, screener falls below recognized benchmark. So let's say the Istation data told us the student isn't meeting benchmark. We've identified this area that we feel like we need to work. Now we're going to provide some additional formative assessments to see if it matches that data that we now have from our screener assessment. And then we want to compare those and make sure we're identifying that lowest deficit skill. We must begin instruction on the lowest deficit skill. So sometimes also students with dyslexia have holes, and you'll notice they're able to read these type of words, but maybe are controlled and vowel teams, they have really difficulty reading those, but then a later on skill they can do. So phoneme deletion for this student is on benchmark. Phoneme segmentation, which is really the most challenging skill, they're just listed separately on that little table that I presented here in the slide. So sentence segmentation, basic syllable, onset rhyme, basic phoneme awareness, so initial and final sounds, and then advanced phoneme awareness, medial sounds, phoneme deletion, phoneme segmentation, etc. So you want to find that lowest deficit skill, start instruction there. I am going to pop over to the chat for a moment because I see some action happening there. Definitely take a look at the link that Robin provided of the letter and Pearson materials. And yes, good to know about the dyslexia screener. I didn't know that as well.
I didn't either. And I will chime in too, Sally. Our legacy IRI, where we did the probes from AimsWeb, those are a Pearson product, or they were a Pearson product and still are. So
excellent. Thanks for that information. And yes, I am familiar with the Hegarty Phonemic Awareness Program. I am a big fan. I do like it. It's very systematic and it provides a lot of practice. And I mentioned in an earlier chat, I think during Dr. Barbour's presentation, is that sometimes these off-the-shelf programs that we have available in our classrooms and in our districts, they may be a good base, but they are missing many things. And as educators and teachers, we have to know how to identify where the holes are in the programs that we're using. Many students with dyslexia or other reading difficulties need intense practice, and that does not provide intense practice, or there may be a skill that is missing. So that's why it's really important to understand that lowest deficit skill concept and build your instruction from that.
thank you, Kim, for chiming in and saying that Sally Shaywitz put her dyslexia screener with Pearson. If you haven't read the books by Sally Shaywitz, definitely a place to start if you want to know more about dyslexia and assessment.
And recently her second edition came out, Overcoming Dyslexia Second Edition, and it's available and very helpful for those of you that are just kind of starting your journey about finding out more about dyslexia. Oh, and there's a book study from Kim's class as well. Excellent. So now we're looking at phonics, thinking of an example. Some teachers in districts around the state, I know, use the Core Phonics Survey. It's even available online now. You don't even have to necessarily have the text to access it. But students are falling below that recognized benchmark. What am I going to do? I administer that decoding survey to identify a specific area and to confirm the data I already have. And if I do administer it and I see a very different very different information, I may want to do some other assessments to confirm where I need to start. So here is the sequence of instruction. So short vowels and CVC words. And in this measure, the measure goes in this order. So when a student is then not meeting benchmark, we need to start instruction. So based on this information, go ahead and put in the chat, for this student, where would we begin instruction in phonics? This is a grade 3 student, so has had lots of early reading experiences in systematic instruction. Excellent. Variant vowels, I'm seeing that come through, and that is correct. So variant vowels, I would probably start on the beginning of that introduction of variant vowels. So those vowel combinations that are tricky for students to learn because they've learned that silent E, and now that's not working anymore. For some reason, I can't use silent E, or the silent E isn't there. So that student needs really systematic, explicit instruction using variant vowels. And this student, I don't believe she has dyslexia. I think the holes in her reading are really based on instruction, that she did not receive that instruction, and possibly because she missed spring semester being in school with COVID. And her mom shared with me that had a really big impact on her. And so where do I need to go from here? I need to start instruction there.
And there's a question in the chat. How about the diagnostic tools in Imagine Learning? I am very familiar with that program as well. The state provides Imagine Learning for our EL students, and it functions similarly to Istation, that it provides an assessment and places a student in curriculum. And I think the diagnostic tools there are good. I would always bring folks back, as kind of Sally is highlighting, to those domains of reading, you know, looking at phonics, phonemic awareness, language, fluency. We want to use diagnostic data in a way that is very targeted and reaches the student's greatest area of need, even if that's all the way back to language comprehension.
Yes, thank you for that point, Alayna. And Robin also mentioned in the chat, Teaching Reading is Rocket Science by Dr. Louisa Moats. And I love that article. And it's one that I've implemented in my first beginning reading, teaching reading course at College of Idaho, because it's very impactful. Teaching reading is hard, and it takes a lot of teacher knowledge. And teacher knowledge can make the difference in effective interventions. So thank you for bringing that up. So we've had some comments about how do we assess older students. So thinking of those major components of reading, we have the big 5 from the National Reading Panel. 20 years ago, they put that out, and evidence shows that we need to have instruction in phonological awareness, including phonemic awareness, phonics, fluency, vocabulary, and comprehension. Since then, much additional research has been completed and shared, and we know there are other additional components that we have to pay attention to, and subcomponents of those areas are important that we need to pay attention to. And our end slide, or one of the last few slides, actually shows a framework from the Barksdale Reading Institute that includes those details, and I would recommend going to their site and pulling up their little graphic. It's a very good overview and framework to see how to put all these pieces together. So comprehension measures, we want to look at, hey, the beginning of the year screener falls below benchmark for reading comprehension. What do I need to do? So first off, we need to go and see if we can figure out that lowest deficit skill. So a decoding assessment or language assessment, because if it is one of those deficit skills, comprehension strategies aren't going to cut it in improving reading comprehension. We have to go back to that lowest deficit skill. And I hear you with someone's comment about it's difficult when your child is older, 5th, 6th, 7th, 8th, 9th grade, and they don't want to do this baby stuff. Like, they understand that there's something amiss and it's not working, and I don't want to go back. It's embarrassing. People know around me that I'm not reading well, etc. So I want to share an experience. One of my most impactful experiences in the classroom is I had a 10th grade student that came to me, and the schedule at the high school was all messed up. And she ended up being the only student in my class for a study skills class. Of course, they fixed that, and a week later, I had a full class. But this gave me the opportunity to really do some formative assessments with her and figure out what was going awry. She was reading on about a 3rd or 4th grade level, if I remember correctly, and nobody had ever shared this information with her as a 10th grade student. When I shared that with her, she broke out into tears. This was also a girl that was tough. She was thrown out of class pretty regularly. And I was like, what can I do to help her? I need to figure it out, because I know what I do can make a big impact on how successful she is in college, or in high school. College, hopefully, but for now, college or high school. So I talked to her about, there are some instructional things I can do with you to help you be a stronger reader, but you have to trust me that I do know how to teach reading, and that this is going to help you, but it takes a lot of work. Now, it took us a while to get in a place where she was comfortable with that, and that she was okay going back and learning some more basic skills. One example of a success with her is she came into my room one time and she was very angry because she had to do a PowerPoint for science, and she said, I can't read the slides well, what am I going to do? And we talked about that really the science textbook that she was reading was 10th grade to 12th grade reading level, and that many of those words she was unable to decode. So how is she supposed to learn that material? So we talked about that and an additional way to then learn that content, and that good presenters don't read the slides. So if you talk about these big ideas while you're showing the slides, you're going to be an excellent presenter. So we worked on that, and that was a strength for her. So the day came when she gave her presentation, and she ran into my classroom afterwards and she said, Miss Brown, I got an A on my presentation. And she was beaming. She was beaming. She was so excited. Now, that year with her, with me, did she jump to grade level, reading grade level, at grade level? No. Did she make progress? Yes. And because of those diagnostic assessments that I administered and shared with her, I could show her her progress. So that in and of itself is motivation for an older student to engage in more of the early reading skills and phonemic awareness skills that they have missed. Now, does it work every time? No, but I think a relationship between a student teacher can be really, really powerful. So one example of a comprehension measure that you can administer, I would also look at vocabulary as well with an older student that is not meeting benchmarks. But looking at maze passages. Maze passages delete every 7th word, and the student has to do a silent reading task and select the correct word that fits into that sentence. I created this one just really quickly in a couple minutes as a sample from Intervention Central. Dibbles has published free resources for maze passages, maze comprehension measures. And if you're familiar with their site, they have fluency, they have letter name fluency, nonsense word reading, fluency passages for every grade level, and comprehension maze passages. It's a really amazing resource provided by the University of Oregon that if you're not familiar with it, make sure you go and explore their site because it can be very, very beneficial to have that additional data to accompany what you've already done in your classroom. I want to pop over to the chat for a moment and make sure I haven't.
Sally, I want to add to the importance of, your arrow on the right and this idea of administering a decoding or vocabulary measure for older students. On a personal note, I have 2 sons who are dyslexic, one of which was identified while we lived in Texas and got a fabulous intervention program. Both of my kids have a phonological dyslexia. So spelling, phonemic awareness, phonological awareness are very, very hard for them. And my older son, who received the intervention that he needed, is now a 10th grader and does phenomenal in reading. But my younger son, who's now a sixth grader, who, when his scores were low in phonological awareness, got put in a Read Naturally group for fluency practice, didn't ever get the appropriate intervention because he wasn't diagnosed through the data correctly. So really important for those that are teachers and parents, be an advocate for diagnostic data and giving kids the appropriate intervention, because it can make all the difference for them.
Thank you, Alayna, for sharing that example. I think it's so important to see how this plays out in real life. And as students get older in the grades in school and being served in special education, sometimes we're not seeing some of those decoding or language assessments because their problems are now comprehension vocabulary. So we tend to hit. And if we don't know that they still have a decoding problem and spelling that we need to address, then it's going to be hard for them to really make any growth. I wanted to share some actual data here to see how this looks. I include the oral reading fluency benchmark numbers, words correct per minute as well, is because we provide this in my virtual clinic as well. And this student, fourth grade student, is 100 words correct per minute. So we look up there at the beginning of the year. She should be receiving core support and fluency. She's doing okay. Accuracy rate, 92%. That's not high enough to really comprehend a text. So we see that she needs strategic support in accuracy. That aligns with, okay, we have some decoding issues here. And then we look at the maze comprehension measure. She also is showing for the fall, beginning of year, she's falling in the strategic support area. And if she doesn't have growth in that area, by middle of the year, she's going to be in intensive support.
And there's a question in the chat. It says, are there students that cannot overcome reading difficulties through a phonetic approach? And I would say, based on what I know about dyslexia, and I'll let others chime in too, phonetic dyslexia is only one type. My children happen to have phonological difficulties, but that is not every type of dyslexia. So it really is very student specific in terms of what the data has said. Some kids it's language, other kids it's memory. So it really just depends.
Thank you, Alayna. And in my experience, the older the reader is, the harder it is to intervene and the more intense the intervention needs to be. So that's why those K-3 classrooms and really identifying students that need additional intensive instruction and making sure that instruction is filling their gap is so critical. Now, I taught in secondary schools for a number of years, and sometimes that would get a little frustrating. So there's nothing I can do. There's always things you can do. And I've seen students make progress phonologically and in phonics, even when receiving that instruction later, but it takes more time, more effort, more intensity. Oh, thank you for posting the University of Oregon site, Alayna, there.
Yep.
Now, this is the framework that I shared with you from Barksdale Reading Institute. I kind of put the information in this table, but please go to their website. They have amazing materials also in readinguniverse.org. You have to sign up for an account, but it is free. University of Florida also has some great resources. I did not include their information on our reference slide, but take a look at that. Even doing a search for University of Florida reading, you'll start pulling up some really great things from there. So there are a lot of free materials out there that I feel like we just need to share with other teachers and parents to become familiar with some of these materials. So here at the top, highlighting those areas that we need to be targeting. So if we look at any area that from my little table in earlier slide that we need to further assess, and we give a diagnostic assessment, and now we've identified what areas they can and cannot do, And now we can look at, across this framework, where do they need to be receiving intensive instruction? And I would argue even older readers, like I just mentioned, still need instruction in these earlier skills if they are not meeting benchmarks for their grade level. As they become older, they become also maybe more defiant in doing these, but I would say never give up, because I have seen great progress in students receiving multisyllabic word training and then being able to identify syllables in words, identify onset and rhyme in words, identify word parts and how that's related to vocabulary instruction. It's pretty exciting when they start seeing some of that come together. So what questions do you have? I'm going to stop sharing my screen. So
I see one question, Sally, in the chat. I know later this month we'll be learning about dysgraphia. My question is there a connection between these and dyscalculia?
all right. Alayna, do you want to take that first, or shall I take it first?
You know, I know a very little about dyscalculia. I know that it is in the visual spatial part of the brain, but that's about all I know.
Okay, thank you. In my personal experience, students that often have dyslexia often have dysgraphia and also dyscalculia, and that also can be very difficult to provide intervention for as students get older, because there are so many areas that are lacking. Or maybe a student has had really great reading instruction in the early grades, but didn't have maybe great systematic writing instruction in the later years. And so that can have an effect on then where their skill level is. And yes, there is a webinar coming up from Dr. Barbour about dysgraphia. So that'll be fun to learn more about that. Moving alphabet is a great way to help dyslexic students. I'm dyslexic, and it was a real aha moment for me to see the syllables. Thank you for that example, Kim.
Another great program where my training comes from is Orton Gillingham. It's a multisensory approach that teaches syllable types and all those little spelling and decoding rules. I'm using it right now in some tutoring, and in my experience, it's been really effective as well.
Yes, thank you for that. Multisensory approaches, two things you can do search fors to really learn more about those areas are multisensory approaches to reading instruction and structured literacy. Those search terms will open up a wide variety of materials and discussions that you can dive down and learn more about. Yes, the webinars coming up will be recorded, so you can access those at a later date all the way through the end of December for sure. Does the research show any correlation between dyslexia and left-handed children? I have never run across any research that demonstrates that, so I would agree with Kim, no. Other questions? Really good questions and discussion and things you're thinking about. I appreciate that. I know there are so many teachers, parents, administrators, district folks, state folks that really want to improve instruction in the classroom to really help students with characteristics of dyslexia and other reading difficulties. And you being here is making that difference. And the more we can share this knowledge around our state, the more effective our instruction is going to be and the use of data in the classroom. So thank you so much for being here. Feel free to continue to put questions in the chat. And Robin, I'll turn it back over to you.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Dr. Brown. Thank you, Alayna. And thank you everyone that joined us this morning and everyone that's gonna tune in at their convenience and watch the recorded session. We look forward to having you in our upcoming webinars. So you will be receiving emails to remind you of those. Those also will be offered live every Wednesday from 6 to 7:30, and will also be recorded and accessible for you at your convenience. So I wanted to ask Dr. Zadel to pop in here for a minute. I think there might be some questions about the CEU credits, Kim.
Yeah, some of you I know, like the SLPs, you need credit hours instead of credits that normal classroom teachers need. If you need documentation for credit hours or for the hours attending, please email me. It's in the chat. It's KM Zeydel, ZEYDEL. That should be Gmail, not just mail. gmail.com. And those of you who need information on the course that goes along with this, it will be coming out hopefully next week. I have to wait for NNU to approve the course, which it's just a matter of technicalities here. And then we'll get out a flyer. So I will put my correct email in there again. So
and to answer the question about how to access the recordings, we have everybody's email who registered. So as long as you registered with your email, you'll be getting a link to the recording from today. You'll also be getting more information from Dr. Zeydel about the CEU opportunity at NNU. And we'll also be sending out a reminder weekly about the webinars with a link to join those. So just be sure we have your email. Again, my email is Robin, ROBIN, at decodingdyslexiaidaho.org. Just send any questions my way and I'll make sure that we get to you the information that you need.
Robin, there's one last question in the chat and I can absolutely speak to this. Stephanie said, my son's teacher solution for intervention is Imagine Learning. Is this enough or should I push for more? I would say go back to your data. Data is a strong proponent for what's right. And if the data says that your child needs something that Imagine Learning is not explicitly and systematically providing, then you have a place to speak up, and you absolutely should as a parent.
I would second that, and I appreciate the data perspective, but I'm a mom and data doesn't make a lot of sense to me. So I always encourage my moms and parents to follow your mommy gut and push for what your child needs. And we have a lot that we can do as a team. Just work with your teachers. I've yet to meet an Idaho educator who does not want to do all that they can for our kiddos. So I'm here to help you also in how to better advocate for your kiddos in our public school system. So again, reach out to me. I'm here to help. Any other questions before we close out? There's a question that popped up. Our program has been using eSpark. It changes levels based on the needs of the kids.
I don't know that program, but I'm all for computer adaptive level programs.
Thank you, everyone. We've got a question that popped up. I'm afraid to open this can of worms, but explain the issue of not using dyslexia when we do comprehensive evaluations for SLD.
I can speak to that kind of broadly, but the difficulty is IDEA, Identify Specific Learning Disability, with dyslexia under it as kind of the subcategory. So many states use that and then have the word dyslexia in their state manuals for identification of students with disabilities, but it is challenging because what our school psychologists are faced with is they can't diagnose dyslexia. That they can say characteristics of dyslexia, and it's often medical professionals outside of our school systems that are making the diagnosis of dyslexia. The whole nation is kind of trying to, that people that are behind this dyslexia movement is really trying to move towards the area that, hey, we can identify it specifically, and then we look at, does the child qualify for special education services, not just based on their dyslexia diagnosis. This is what people do now, not based on their diagnosis, but how it impacts their learning. So it's pretty complicated, and there are some states that have done it differently in the past as well. I know in Texas, young students with dyslexia would get served under Section 504, and maybe Alayna can speak to that briefly, but it is a little bit messy right now.
Yes, Sally. Texas is the only state that I know of that serves dyslexia outside of an IEP or a special education SLD identification. They do it through a 504, and it's separate legislation that is completely outside of special education, so they're unique in that. And then there was a question just asking if the state will be looking into more or Gillingham types of programs. You know, I can't speak to what the state will or will not do in the future, but I can share with you that we are currently, and Sally and Robin are both a part of this process, updating our state comprehensive literacy plan to really have more of a K-3 focus. And in that plan that goes through the State Board of Education, we are certainly going to address best practice, things that need to happen. And that's our first step, because then the state board sees what is needed, and the State Department of Education, who's under the state board, can then go in the direction that we need to be going.
And also, it's kind of a side note to Alayna's comment, is that they're in the state of Idaho, K-3 students that are not meeting benchmarks should be on an Idaho reading plan. And this was implemented, I think, 2017, if I remember correctly. But the language is going to be heavy around the Idaho reading plan in the Idaho Comprehensive Literacy updated document. And so as parents, I think this is an important thing to know and be able to ask teachers and principals and administrators and instructional coaches about, because many schools are not implementing it. Districts have to submit a district literacy plan, etc. But for some reason, we're not necessarily seeing it at the teacher and school level. And I think teachers do not know about it. So part of my effort is I really want to get that knowledge out, and then let teachers know how this works. How do they do this? How do they get support to do this? And so we can really track the progress of our students when they're not meeting benchmarks.
Yep, that's right. It's called the Individualized Literacy Plan, and it is in code, written by the State Board of Education, that students who are not a Tier 1 on the IRI have that plan in place. And then for the question, will the state support dyslexia training? Similarly to what Sally explained, dyslexia in Idaho is a part of a specific learning disability identification. We do offer a lot of training for specific learning disabilities, because that's what our identification is, that includes dyslexia. And that would be through our State Special Education Support and Technical Assistance Center, or SESTA. They provide training specific to SLD, or specific learning disability, where dyslexia currently sits.
And if you're new to this group, or in knowing Robin, you'll know that this is one of her big efforts, is to really provide additional training around dyslexia for teachers in our state. So stay involved, and you'll be privy to these things as they come out, because we're always working to provide more and better training.
That's right. We did establish ourselves as a 501c3 nonprofit. Decoding Dyslexia Idaho chapter is a nonprofit, so we do raise money. We know that money in Idaho education is certainly not enough, so we do work hard to raise money. Our goal is to partner with our educators. Again, like I said, I've not yet met an Idaho educator who isn't passionate about supporting their kiddos. They're just oftentimes lacking resources and training. So that's what we're here to do, offer things like today, and continue to get the word out and a better understanding, so that we don't continue to have the wait and fail model that Idaho currently has. So It's exciting to see some of the changes that are taking place down at the State Department and in the board with this revision of the Comprehensive Literacy Plan. My hope is that legislation will follow that. We are one of only 5 states that does not currently have dyslexia legislation passed. So in effort, I need more voices. It's always more impactful when I have educators and parents that can speak to the importance of this. So thanks for being here. Any last questions before we sign off? Sally and Alayna, thank you so much. Great information. It was a great day.
Thanks for having us.
Yeah, thank you so much.
Thank you all.
Great job.